Hello, creatures of the night. Welcome to the channel where fear meets fun. Before we begin our macabre journey today, I want to ask you to leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'll love reading your response. Don't forget to hit the like button and get ready to sleep with plenty of fear, all because the incessant honking of car horns faded into the distance as Peter's weathered Subaru wound its way up the forested mountain road. He rolled down the window, inhaling deeply. The crisp scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, a stark contrast to the smog-choked air of Seattle he'd left behind. Finally, Peter muttered to himself, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Just me and the great outdoors. The last few months had been a blur of deadlines, meetings, and sleepless nights. The stress had taken its toll, leaving Peter feeling hollow and disconnected. This solo camping trip was long overdue, a chance to recharge and reconnect with the natural world he loved so dearly. As he navigated the twisting road, memories of childhood camping trips with his father flooded back. The crackling of campfires, the taste of slightly burned marshmallows, and the wonder of stargazing in the wilderness. Those simpler times seemed a lifetime ago now. Peter's reverie was broken by a sudden bump in the road. He slowed the car, pulling over at a small turnout. The trailhead he was looking for should be nearby. Killing the engine, he stepped out and stretched, his joints popping in protest after the long drive. The air was cooler here, a light mist clinging to the towering evergreens that surrounded him. Peter took a moment to consult his map, tracing the route he'd planned with his finger. The trail would lead him deep into the heart of Olympic National Forest, far from any signs of civilization. "All right, let's do this," he said, psyching himself up as he began unloading his gear. Peter methodically checked and double-checked his equipment. Tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, first aid kit, everything was accounted for. He hoisted his heavy backpack with a grunt, adjusting the straps until the weight settled comfortably on his hips. As he locked the car and pocketed the keys, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Was he really prepared for several days alone in the wilderness? The forest suddenly seemed more imposing, its shadows deeper and more foreboding. Peter shook his head, banishing the negative thoughts. "Come on, man. You've been planning this for months. No backing out now." With a deep breath, he set off down the narrow trail. The path was overgrown in places, clearly not as well traveled as some of the more popular routes. That was fine by Peter. The solitude was exactly what he was after. As he hiked, the tensions of city life began to melt away. The rhythmic crunch of leaves and twigs under his boots became a soothing melody, punctuated by the occasional call of a distant bird. Peter found himself falling into a comfortable rhythm, his breath syncing with his steps. Hours passed, the forest growing denser as Peter ventured further from the trailhead. The canopy above thickened, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. He paused occasionally to consult his map and compass, ensuring he stayed on course. As the afternoon wore on, Peter began to search for a suitable campsite. He'd hoped to cover more ground on the first day, but the weight of his pack and the rugged terrain had slowed his progress. Still, he'd managed to put a good distance between himself and the nearest road. A clearing up ahead caught his eye. A small, relatively flat area nestled between the massive roots of an ancient cedar. "This'll do nicely," Peter murmured, shrugging off his backpack with relief. He set about making camp with practiced efficiency. The tent went up quickly, and soon a small fire was crackling merrily in a ring of stones. As Peter sat back, admiring his handiwork, a sense of accomplishment washed over him. This was what he'd been missing. The simple satisfaction of self-reliance in the wilderness. As the light began to fade, Peter decided to gather some extra firewood for the night. He wandered a short distance from his camp, picking up fallen branches and dry tinder. The forest had grown quiet, save for the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was then that something caught his eye. A glint of metal half buried in the loamy soil at the base of a gnarled old tree. Curious, Peter knelt down, brushing away layers of decaying leaves. "What have we here?" he wondered aloud, carefully extracting the object from the earth. It was a compass, unlike any he'd seen before. The case was tarnished brass, intricately engraved with symbols he didn't recognize. Despite its apparent age, the glass face was uncracked, the needle within unsullied by rust. Peter turned the compass over in his hands, a mixture of excitement and unease settling in his stomach. "How long have you been out here, little guy?" He flipped open the case, expecting the needle to swing towards magnetic north. Instead, it trembled for a moment before snapping decisively to point deeper into the forest, a direction Peter knew couldn't possibly be north. "That's odd," he muttered, frowning. He turned in a slow circle, but the needle remained fixed, as if drawn to some unseen point in the woods. A chill ran down Peter's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. He had the distinct impression that he'd stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to find. The rational part of his mind argued that it was just a broken antique, nothing more. But a deeper instinct, one that had kept his ancestors alive in wilderness like this, whispered that there was more to this compass than met the eye. As darkness fell in earnest, Peter made his way back to camp, the strange compass tucked securely in his pocket. He tried to push it from his mind as he prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated camping food, but his thoughts kept circling back to the mysterious object. Later, as he sat by the dying embers of his fire, Peter pulled out the compass once more. In the flickering firelight, the engravings seemed to shift and dance, forming patterns just beyond the edge of recognition. The needle remained steadfast, pointing unerringly into the darkest part of the forest. "What are you trying to tell me?" Peter whispered, half to himself and half to the compass. As if in response, a gust of wind swept through the camp, causing the trees to creak and groan. Peter's head snapped up, suddenly alert. Had that been a whisper on the wind? A trick of his tired mind, surely. He shook his head, chuckling nervously. "Get a grip, Pete. It's just an old compass." But as he crawled into his tent that night, zipping the flap securely behind him, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest that had seemed so welcoming during the day now felt watchful, alive with secrets. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The hooting of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of some unidentifiable creature. Normal sounds, he told himself. Nothing to be concerned about. Yet sleep proved elusive. Every time Peter closed his eyes, he saw the compass needle, unwavering in its conviction. What lay in that direction? What was pulling it so strongly? As he finally drifted off into an uneasy slumber, one last coherent thought flitted through Peter's mind. Tomorrow, he would follow where the compass led. Whatever he'd stumbled upon, he was now a part of it. And deep in the Olympic National Forest, watched by ancient trees and unseen eyes, a story was unfolding, one that would change Peter's life forever. The first rays of dawn had barely begun to filter through the forest canopy when Peter jolted awake, his heart racing. Something was wrong. The comforting cocoon of his tent felt different, exposed. A chill breeze caressed his face where there should have been only still air. Blinking away the vestiges of sleep, Peter pushed himself up on his elbows. His eyes widened in shock as he took in the scene before him. The front of his tent was in tatters, the tough fabric shredded as if by enormous claws. "What the hell?" Peter muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The campsite beyond the ruined tent was undisturbed, his backpack still hanging from a tree branch, the remnants of last night's fire, nothing but cold ashes. Peter ran a trembling hand through his hair, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Bears? He wondered aloud. But no, the claw marks were all wrong. Too big, too precise. And why tear open the tent without touching anything else? As he stood there, barefoot in the cool morning air, the events of the previous evening came flooding back. The strange compass he'd found, its needle pointing insistently into the depths of the forest. Peter's hand instinctively went to his pocket, feeling the solid weight of the brass object. The moment his fingers brushed against the compass, A jolt of electricity seemed to shoot up his arm. The compass grew warm, almost uncomfortably so, and Peter could swear he felt it pulling, not just metaphorically but with a physical force that tugged at his hand. "Whoa!" Peter exclaimed, yanking the compass from his pocket. The needle was spinning wildly, faster than should have been possible. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the motion stopped. The needle snapped back to the same position it had held the night before, pointing unerringly into the forest. Peter stood frozen, staring at the compass in disbelief. A part of him wanted to chuck the thing as far as he could and hightail it back to civilization, but a stronger, more primal part of his psyche was intrigued. The mystery of it all called to him, whispering of secrets waiting to be uncovered. "This is crazy," Peter said to himself, shaking his head. "I should pack up and go home." Even as the words left his mouth, he knew he wouldn't. Whatever was happening here, he was already too invested to walk away now. With a resigned sigh, Peter set about breaking camp. He salvaged what he could from the shredded tent, packing it away along with the rest of his gear. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed different this morning, more alive, more aware. Once everything was packed, Peter stood at the edge of the clearing, compass in hand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. "All right," he said, addressing the compass as if it could hear him. "You want to show me something? Let's go see what it is." With that, Peter stepped off the trail and into the untamed wilderness, following the insistent pull of the compass. The going was tough from the start. Unlike the well-worn hiking trail, this part of the forest was dense and unforgiving. Peter had to push through thick underbrush, navigate around fallen trees, and scramble over moss-covered boulders. All the while, the compass tugged at him, urging him onward. As the morning wore on, Peter began to notice subtle changes in his surroundings. The trees seemed to grow larger, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The underbrush thinned out, replaced by patches of strange, luminescent fungi he'd never seen before. The very air felt different, heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. "What is this place?" Peter wondered aloud, his voice sounding oddly muffled in the stillness of the forest. As if in response, a gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it what sounded like whispered words in a language Peter didn't recognize. He spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello?" he called out, immediately feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered him. Peter shook his head, trying to clear it. "Get it together, man. You're letting your imagination run wild." He pressed on, the compass growing warmer in his hand with each step. The pull was stronger now, almost painful in its insistence. Peter found himself having to consciously resist the urge to break into a run. It was nearing midday when Peter stumbled upon something that stopped him in his tracks. There, carved into the trunk of a massive cedar, was a symbol, the same intricate design he'd seen engraved on the compass case. "No way," Peter breathed, reaching out to trace the carving with his fingers. The moment he touched the symbol, it began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. Peter jerked his hand back as if burned, but the glow remained. As he watched in amazement, other symbols began to appear on nearby trees, each lighting up in turn. "This can't be real," Peter said, his voice shaking. "I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming." But he knew he wasn't. This was all too vivid, too tactile to be a dream. The compass in his hand grew hotter still, the pull now so strong it was all he could do to keep from being yanked forward. Peter looked down at the compass, then back at the glowing symbols. He was way past the point of no return now. Whatever was happening here, he was a part of it. "Okay," he said, squaring his shoulders. "You want me to follow? I'll follow." With renewed determination, Peter continued on his journey, guided by the compass and the trail of glowing symbols. The forest around him seemed to come alive, branches reaching out as if trying to touch him as he passed. More than once he could have sworn he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures that vanished when he turned to look. As the afternoon wore on, Peter's rational mind began to war with what his senses were telling him. This couldn't be happening. Compasses didn't behave this way. Trees didn't glow, forests didn't whisper. And yet, here he was, experiencing it all firsthand. "I've lost it," Peter muttered to himself. "I've completely lost my mind." Just then, a child's laughter echoed through the trees clear as a bell. Peter's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the forest frantically. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of running feet. Peter spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "This isn't funny," he shouted, an edge of panic creeping into his voice. "Show yourself!" Silence fell once more, heavy and oppressive. Peter stood there, chest heaving, straining his ears for any sound. But there was nothing. No laughter, no footsteps, not even the usual forest noises of birds and small animals. The compass chose that moment to give an almighty lurch, nearly pulling itself out of Peter's grasp. He looked down at it, noting with a mix of fear and anticipation that the needle was spinning rapidly again. "What now?" Peter asked, not really expecting an answer. The needle suddenly stopped, pointing off to Peter's left. Without conscious thought, he found himself moving in that direction, pushed by a compulsion he couldn't explain. He pushed through a thick curtain of ferns and found himself in a small clearing. In the center stood a standing stone, easily twice Peter's height, covered in the same strange symbols he'd seen on the trees and the compass. As Peter approached the stone, the symbols began to glow, pulsing in a hypnotic rhythm. The compass in his hand grew almost unbearably hot, but he found he couldn't let go. Drawn as if by an invisible force, Peter reached out his free hand towards the stone. Just before his fingers made contact, he hesitated, a final moment of doubt washing over him. "Last chance to turn back," he said to himself. But he knew he wouldn't. Couldn't. Whatever this was, whatever was happening, he had to see it through. Taking a deep breath, Peter pressed his palm against the cool surface of the stone. The world exploded into light and sound. Images flashed before Peter's eyes too quickly to comprehend. Ancient forests, strange rituals, faces both human and other. He heard voices speaking in languages long forgotten, felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Peter found himself on his knees in the clearing, gasping for breath. The standing stone was dark and silent once more, but Peter knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. He looked down at the compass in his hand. The needle had stopped moving, now pointing directly at the stone. As Peter watched, new symbols began to appear on the compass case, glowing briefly before fading into the metal. "What have I gotten myself into?" Peter whispered, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through him. As if in answer, a warm breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The journey has only just begun." Peter stood on shaky legs, looking from the compass to the stone and back again. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. With one last look at the clearing, Peter turned and headed back into the forest, the compass guiding his way. Whatever lay ahead, whatever secrets this ancient place held, he was determined to uncover them all. The trees seemed to whisper as he passed, their branches reaching for him like old friends welcoming him home. And deep in the heart of the Olympic National Forest, watched by forces older than time itself, Peter took the first steps on a journey that would change him forever. The forest had grown denser, the air thick with an otherworldly mist that seemed to cling to everything it touched. Peter had lost all sense of time. His world narrowed down to the relentless pull of the compass and the eerie glow of symbols that appeared and disappeared on the trees around him. He stumbled forward, exhaustion gnawing at his bones. How long had he been walking? Hours? Days? It felt like an eternity since he'd left his destroyed campsite behind. Just a little further. Peter muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from disuse. It has to end somewhere. As if in response to his words, the compass gave a sudden jerk, nearly flying out of his grasp. Peter tightened his grip, gritting his teeth against the searing heat that radiated from the device. All right, he growled. I hear you. Where do you want me to go? The mist before him seemed to part, revealing a narrow path he hadn't noticed before. Without hesitation, Peter plunged forward, pushing through low-hanging branches and thorny underbrush. Suddenly, the forest opened up, and Peter found himself on the edge of a vast clearing. He blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden change in his surroundings. The mist here was even thicker, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. What is this place? Peter whispered, awe and trepidation warring in his voice. As his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the mist. At first, Peter thought they were oddly shaped boulders, scattered haphazardly across the clearing. But as he ventured closer, his breath caught in his throat. They were headstones, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, rising from the mist-covered ground like the remnants of a forgotten civilization. A cemetery. Peter breathed, his mind reeling. Out here in the middle of nowhere? He approached the nearest headstone, brushing away a thick coating of moss. The stone beneath was weathered and cracked, but Peter could make out faint engravings. He traced his fingers over the marks, frowning in confusion. What language is this? He wondered aloud. The symbols were unlike anything he'd ever seen before, more complex and fluid than any alphabet he knew. A chill ran down Peter's spine as he realized the symbols bore a striking resemblance to those on the compass and the glowing trees. Whatever force had led him here, it was clear this place was intimately connected to it. Peter moved from stone to stone, examining each in turn. Some were so weathered that no markings remained visible, while others seemed impossibly well preserved, as if they had been carved yesterday. As he delved deeper into the cemetery, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. More than once he spun around, certain he'd caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. But each time, he saw nothing but mist and stone. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness of the clearing. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered him, but it was a loaded silence, heavy with anticipation. Peter shook his head, trying to clear it. The oppressive atmosphere of this place was getting to him, making him imagine things. He turned back to the headstones, determined to make sense of this mysterious graveyard. As he examined a particularly ornate marker, a sound broke the silence, the clear, bright laughter of a child. Peter's head snapped up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. "Who's there? Do you need help?" The laughter came again, seeming to dance around him, impossible to pinpoint. It was joined by other sounds, whispers, footsteps, the rustle of clothing. Yet no matter where Peter looked, he saw no one. "This isn't funny," he shouted, fear and frustration coloring his voice. "Show yourself." As suddenly as they had started, the sounds ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on Peter from all sides. He stood there, chest heaving, straining his ears for any noise. After what felt like an eternity, Peter forced himself to relax. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "You're letting this place get to you." Determined to continue his exploration, Peter turned back to the headstones. He moved deeper into the cemetery, the mist growing thicker with each step. The compass in his hand hummed with energy, growing warmer as he progressed. Suddenly, Peter stopped short. There, looming out of the mist before him, was a headstone larger than the rest. Unlike the others, this one seemed to repel the moss and lichen that covered its neighbors. Its surface was smooth and unblemished, the engravings crisp and clear. With a trembling hand, Peter reached out to trace the symbols. As his fingers made contact with the stone, a jolt of energy surged through him. The engravings began to glow with an inner light, pulsing in time with Peter's racing heartbeat. "What the—" Peter began, but the words died in his throat as the glowing symbols rearranged themselves before his eyes. Slowly, impossibly, they formed into words he could understand. Peter's eyes widened as he read the message that appeared. "Welcome, Guardian. Your journey begins here." "Guardian?" Peter whispered, confusion and a strange sense of destiny warring within him. "What does that mean?" As if in answer, the compass in his hand gave a violent jerk. Peter looked down, watching in amazement as the needle spun wildly before coming to rest, pointing directly at the glowing headstone. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it whispers in a language Peter didn't understand but somehow felt he should know. The mist swirled around him, taking on shapes that were almost but not quite human. Peter's gaze was drawn back to the headstone and his blood ran cold. There, beneath the glowing message, new words had appeared. Peter James Holloway. His name. His full name, which he hadn't told anyone on this trip. "How is this possible?" Peter breathed, stumbling back from the stone. "This can't be real. It can't be." But even as he denied it, Peter knew in his heart that this was all too real. Whatever forces had led him here, whatever destiny awaited him, there was no turning back now. As that realization settled over him, the cemetery seemed to come alive. The whispers grew louder, the mist shapes more defined. Peter could almost make out faces now, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. The compass in his hand grew hot, almost too hot to hold. Peter looked down at it, watching as new symbols etched themselves into its surface, glowing with the same inner light as the headstone. "Okay," Peter said, his voice shaky but determined. "I don't understand what's happening, but I'm here. I'm listening. What do you want from me?" The whispers rose to a crescendo, and for a moment, Peter thought he could almost understand them. Words and phrases danced just at the edge of comprehension, speaking of ancient pacts, guardians, and a duty that spanned millennia. Suddenly, the cacophony ceased. In the ringing silence that followed, a single voice spoke, clear and distinct. "The choice is yours, Peter Holloway. Embrace your destiny or walk away. But know that once the path is chosen, there is no return." Peter stood there, heart pounding, as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. Everything he knew, everything he believed about the world, had been turned upside down in the span of a few days. He looked around the misty cemetery, at the ancient headstones and the glowing symbols. He thought about the strange compass that had led him here, and the series of impossible events that had brought him to this moment. Part of him wanted to run, to flee back to the safety and sanity of his old life. But a stronger part, a part he was only just beginning to understand, knew that he couldn't walk away from this. Taking a deep breath, Peter stepped forward, placing his hand on the glowing headstone that bore his name. "I choose to stay," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't understand everything that's happening, but I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to embrace whatever destiny awaits me here." As the last word left his lips, the cemetery erupted into light. The glowing symbols on the headstones blazed like miniature suns, and the mist shapes coalesced into more solid forms. Peter caught glimpses of faces both human and other, all watching him with approval and something that looked like relief. The compass in his hand gave one final, violent jerk before going still. When Peter looked down at it, he saw that its face had changed. The needle now pointed in multiple directions at once, and the symbols around the edge pulsed with a steady, comforting light. As the glow began to fade and the mist shapes dissipated, Peter felt a profound change come over him. He couldn't put it into words, but he knew that he was no longer the same person who had entered this clearing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever mysteries this ancient place held, Peter was ready to face them. He had taken the first step on a journey beyond imagination, and there was no going back. With one last look at the headstone bearing his name, Peter turned and walked deeper into the cemetery. The mist parted before him, revealing a path he hadn't seen before. And as he set off down this new road, the whispers of the ancient guardians followed him, welcoming him to a world he was only beginning to understand. The night settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a silence so profound that Peter could hear his own heartbeat. He had made camp at the edge of the mysterious cemetery, unable to bring himself to leave the site of his strange transformation. As he lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the stars peeking through the canopy, sleep seemed impossibly far away. "What have I gotten myself into?" Peter whispered to the darkness. The events of the day played on repeat in his mind. The glowing headstones, the whispering mist, the moment he had accepted a destiny he still didn't understand. It all seemed like a dream now, but the weight of the compass against his chest was a constant reminder of the reality of his situation. As exhaustion finally began to overtake him, Peter's eyes drifted shut. Almost immediately, he found himself plunged into a dream unlike any he had experienced before. He stood in a vast, primordial forest. The trees around him were impossibly tall, their trunks wider than houses. The air was thick with mist, but this mist was alive, swirling with colors and shapes that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. From the mist, faces began to emerge, grotesque, beautiful, alien, familiar. They swirled around Peter, their voices a cacophony of whispers. "Guardian," they called. "Protector, keeper of the balance." "I don't understand," Peter tried to say, but no sound came out. A figure stepped forward from the crowd, its features constantly shifting between human and something other. When it spoke, its voice was 1,000 voices in one. "You have been chosen, Peter Holloway. The forest has awakened you to your true purpose." "But what is that purpose?" Peter asked, finding his voice at last. "What am I supposed to do?" The figure's expression turned grave. "The balance is threatened. The old ways are being forgotten. You must remember, Guardian. You must protect." "Protect what? From what?" Peter pressed, frustration building. "I need more than riddles." But the figure was already fading, the mist swallowing it up. The last thing Peter heard before the dream dissolved was an urgent warning. "Beware the digger of graves. He seeks what was never meant to be found." Peter's eyes snapped open, his body drenched in sweat. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As he sat up, rubbing his eyes, Peter became aware of something odd. His hands were caked with dirt, as if he'd been digging in his sleep. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered the warning from his dream. "The digger of graves," he murmured, examining his dirt-encrusted fingernails. "What the hell does that mean?" Shaking off the lingering unease from his dream, Peter set about breaking camp. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest around him had changed overnight. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out as if trying to touch him. The very air felt charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Once his gear was packed, Peter pulled out the compass. Its needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on a direction deeper into the forest. "All right," Peter said, addressing the compass as if it could hear him. "Where are we going today?" As if in response, the compass grew warm in his hand. Peter set off in the direction it indicated, pushing through thick underbrush and clambering over moss-covered boulders. As he hiked, Peter's mind wandered back to his dream. The warnings, the talk of balance and protection, it all felt significant, but he couldn't piece it together. What was he supposed to be protecting? And from what? Lost in thought, Peter almost missed the change in his surroundings. The forest had opened up into a small glade, sunlight streaming down through a break in the canopy. In the center of the glade stood a single massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient. As Peter approached the tree, the compass in his hand began to vibrate. He looked down at it, watching in amazement as the needle spun faster and faster. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to shift. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Peter saw through time itself. The great oak flickered and changed, growing from a sapling to a mighty tree, and back again in the blink of an eye. He saw people, countless generations of them, come and go, paying homage to the tree. And then, as quickly as it had started, The vision faded. Peter found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. What was that? He panted, his mind reeling from what he'd seen. As he struggled to his feet, Peter became aware of movement at the edge of the glade. Ghostly figures danced just beyond the tree line, always vanishing when he tried to look directly at them. "Hello?" Peter called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" A whisper of laughter was his only response, along with a rustle of movement deeper into the forest. Without thinking, Peter set off after the sound, pushing through the underbrush. "Wait!" he shouted. "I just want to talk." But the ghostly figures always remained just out of reach, leading Peter deeper and deeper into the forest. He lost all sense of direction, relying solely on the pull of the compass and the fleeting glimpses of his spectral guides. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this strange, primeval forest. Peter's legs ached, his lungs burned, but still he pressed on, driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, Peter burst through a thick curtain of vines and found himself back at his original campsite. "How is this possible?" he muttered, looking around in confusion. "I've been walking for hours. I should be miles away." As he stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, Peter became aware of a change in his surroundings. The forest that had seemed so welcoming when he first arrived now felt oppressive, almost hostile. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more absolute. With growing dread, Peter realized he could no longer find the trail that had led him here. Every direction looked the same, an impenetrable wall of vegetation. "Okay, don't panic," he said to himself, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've got the compass. It led you here. It can lead you out." But when Peter looked down at the compass, his heart sank. The needle was spinning erratically, offering no clear direction. As the reality of his situation sank in, Peter felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was lost, truly lost, in a forest that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The weight of his newfound destiny pressed down on him, feeling more like a curse than a calling. "What am I supposed to do?" he shouted to the uncaring forest. "You brought me here. You chose me. So tell me what I'm meant to do." Only silence answered him. Peter sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the enormity of his situation. He was alone in a forest that seemed alive with ancient magic, tasked with a duty he didn't understand and now hopelessly lost. As he sat there, head in his hands, Peter felt something brush against his arm. He looked up to see a small, iridescent butterfly landing on his sleeve. Its wings glowed with an inner light, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed oddly familiar. Peter watched, transfixed, as the butterfly took flight again, leaving a trail of softly glowing motes in its wake. It fluttered a short distance away, then paused, as if waiting for him. Are you trying to show me something?" Peter asked, hardly daring to believe it. The butterfly's glow intensified, and Peter felt a tug from the compass in his hand. He looked down to see the needle pointing steadily in the direction of the luminous insect. A spark of hope ignited in Peter's chest. He climbed to his feet, his exhaustion forgotten. "All right," he said, a note of determination entering his voice. "Lead the way." As Peter set off after his glowing guide, he felt a shift in the forest around him. The hostility he had sensed earlier melted away, replaced by a feeling of anticipation. It was as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. With each step, Peter felt more certain that he was on the right path. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever mysteries this forest held, he would face them. He had been chosen for a reason, and he was determined to live up to that choice. The butterfly led him deeper into the heart of the forest, towards a destiny that would change him forever. And as he walked, Peter could have sworn he heard the trees whispering, "The Guardian has remembered. The Guardian has returned." The forest had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Peter trudged on, following the pulsing glow of the mysterious butterfly. his mind reeling from the events of the past few days. The trees seemed to press in closer with each step, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. "Just a little further," Peter muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from disuse. "There has to be something at the end of this path." As if in response to his words, the butterfly's glow intensified, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Peter quickened his pace, pushing through a thick curtain of vines. As he emerged on the other side, he stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. Before him stood the mouth of a cave, its entrance partially hidden by cascading vines and moss. The butterfly fluttered towards it, its light reflecting off the damp stone walls. Peter hesitated at the threshold, a shiver running down his spine. "I don't suppose you could just tell me what's in there?" he asked the butterfly, knowing full well he wouldn't get an answer. Taking a deep breath, Peter stepped into the cave. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and something else he couldn't quite identify. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he gasped. The walls of the cave were covered in paintings, intricate and vibrant despite their apparent age. They depicted scenes of rituals, hunts, and battles, but with a surreal, otherworldly quality that made Peter's head spin. "What is this place?" he wondered aloud, his voice echoing off the stone walls. As he moved deeper into the cave, the paintings seemed to come alive, shifting and changing in his peripheral vision. Peter blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but the illusion persisted. Suddenly the butterfly darted ahead, its light illuminating a narrow passage Peter hadn't noticed before. Without hesitation, he followed, squeezing through the tight opening. The passage opened up into a vast chamber, and Peter's jaw dropped in awe. The ceiling soared high above, lost in shadows, while the walls were lined with alcoves filled with strange, glowing artifacts. "This is impossible," Peter breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. His gaze was drawn to a pedestal in the center of the chamber. Atop it sat a mask, unlike anything Peter had ever seen. It seemed to be made of wood, but it shimmered with an inner light that pulsed in time with Peter's heartbeat. Almost against his will, Peter found himself moving towards the mask. The butterfly fluttered around it, its glow merging with the mask's ethereal light. "I shouldn't touch it," Peter said, even as his hand reached out. "This is a bad idea." But it was too late. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the mask, and a jolt of energy surged through him. Before he could react, the mask seemed to come alive, leaping towards his face. Peter stumbled back, crying out in surprise and fear, but the mask clung to him, molding itself to his features. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't breathe. "Help!" he tried to shout, but no sound came out. His vision began to darken at the edges as he clawed desperately at the mask. Just as he thought he would lose consciousness, Peter felt a shift. The mask seemed to melt into his skin, and suddenly he could breathe again. But something was different. The world around him had changed. The cave was alive with light and color. Ghostly figures moved about, engaged in what looked like an ancient ritual. Peter could hear their chants, could feel the vibrations of their drums in his bones. "What's happening?" he gasped, his voice sounding strange and echoing in his ears. One of the figures turned towards him, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. When it spoke, its voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome, Guardian. You have taken the first step on your true path." Peter staggered back, overwhelmed by the sensory overload. "I don't understand. What is this place? What am I seeing?" The figure moved closer, its form shimmering and shifting. "This is the heart of the forest, the nexus of its power. What you see are the echoes of those who came before, the guardians who protected this place through the ages." "But why me?" Peter asked, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "Why was I chosen?" The figure's form solidified slightly, and Peter caught a glimpse of a face that looked eerily like his own. "The forest chooses its guardians carefully, Peter Holloway. You have a strength in you that you've yet to fully realize." Before Peter could ask more questions, the scene around him began to shift. He saw flashes of past guardians facing terrible challenges, battling against forces that threatened the delicate balance of the forest. "The task before you is not an easy one," the figure continued. "Dark forces are stirring, seeking to exploit the power of this place for their own ends." Peter felt a chill run down his spine. "What forces? What do they want?" The figure's form began to fade, its voice growing fainter. "You must discover that for yourself, Guardian. Trust in the forest, and in the power that now resides within you." "Wait!" Peter called out, reaching for the disappearing figure. "I have more questions." But it was too late. The vision faded, and Peter found himself back in the chamber, the mask now gone as if it had never existed. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from what he had experienced. As he knelt there trying to make sense of it all, Peter became aware of a change in himself. He could feel the forest in a way he never had before, could sense the ebb and flow of its ancient power. Slowly, he got to his feet, his legs shaky but his resolve strengthening. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he couldn't run from them. He had been chosen for a reason, and he was determined to live up to that choice. The butterfly, which had been waiting patiently nearby, fluttered towards the cave entrance. Peter nodded, understanding its silent message. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "Let's go. We've got work to do." As Peter made his way back through the winding passages of the cave, he could feel the weight of his new responsibility settling on his shoulders. The forest had chosen him as its guardian, and he was determined not to let it down. Emerging from the cave, Peter blinked in the sudden sunlight. The forest seemed different now, more alive. He could hear whispers in the rustle of leaves, could sense the ancient power flowing through the earth beneath his feet. The butterfly led him down a new path, one that seemed to appear as they walked. Peter followed without hesitation, his senses alert for any sign of the dark forces he had been warned about. As he walked, Peter's mind raced with questions. What were these dark forces? How was he supposed to protect the forest against them? And most importantly, was he truly ready for the task ahead? But with each step, he felt a growing certainty. The forest had chosen him, had awakened something within him that he was only beginning to understand. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Peter knew he would face them head-on. The sun was setting as Peter emerged from the dense forest into a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its branches reaching towards the sky like outstretched arms. As Peter approached the tree, he felt a surge of energy. The butterfly fluttered towards the oak, its glow merging with the tree's own ethereal light. Peter placed his hand on the rough bark, and in that moment, he felt truly connected to the forest for the first time. He could sense its joys and its sorrows, its fears and its hopes. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Peter said softly, "but I promise I'll do everything in my power to protect you." As if in response, a warm breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it a whisper of gratitude and encouragement. Peter squared his shoulders, a new determination filling him. He may not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. His journey as the guardian of the forest had only just begun. Peter's eyes fluttered open, the first rays of dawn filtering through the forest canopy. For a moment he was disoriented, the events of the previous day feeling like a distant dream. But as he sat up, the weight of the compass against his chest and the tingling sensation coursing through his body were stark reminders of his new reality. "So it wasn't a dream after all," he murmured, running a hand through his disheveled hair. As Peter stood, stretching his aching muscles, he became acutely aware of a change in his perception. The forest around him seemed more vibrant, more alive. He could hear the whispers of the trees, feel the pulse of life in the earth beneath his feet. "Is this what it means to be a guardian?" Peter wondered aloud, marveling at his heightened senses. He reached for the compass, which had become his constant companion on this strange journey. As he held it in his palm, the needle began to spin wildly before settling on a direction. But this time, Instead of merely pointing, the compass seemed to speak to him in a language of images and emotions. Peter gasped as visions flooded his mind. A shadowy glade, an ancient stone altar, a gathering of ethereal beings. The images were accompanied by a sense of urgency, a pull that he couldn't ignore. "All right, I get it," Peter said, addressing the compass. "You want me to go there? But a little more clarity would be nice, you know?" As if in response, the compass grew warm in his hand, and Peter felt a gentle tug in the direction the needle pointed. With a resigned sigh, he gathered his few belongings and set off into the forest. As he walked, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was guiding his steps. Branches seemed to move aside to clear his path, roots flattened to prevent him from tripping. It was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to flow differently in this enchanted wood. Peter pushed through a thick curtain of vines and found himself in a clearing unlike any he had seen before. The air here was heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on Peter's arms stand on end. Mist swirled around his feet, forming patterns that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood a massive, shadowy figure. Peter's breath caught in his throat. The entity before him seemed to be made of living smoke, its form constantly shifting and reforming. It towered over him, easily twice his height, with glowing eyes that seemed to peer into his very soul. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, the entity spoke, its voice a low rumble that Peter felt more than heard. "So, the forest has chosen a new guardian. Step forward, Peter Holloway, and be judged." Peter swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. What are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The entity's form rippled, and Peter caught glimpses of faces within the smoke. Some human, some decidedly not. "I am the guardian of guardians, the protector of this sacred place since time immemorial. I am the one who will determine if you are worthy of the task set before you." Gathering his courage, Peter took a step forward. "I didn't ask for this role," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But I'm here, and I'm willing to do what's necessary to protect this forest." A sound like distant thunder rolled through the clearing, the entity's laughter. "Bravely spoken, young one, but words are wind. It is your actions that will prove your worth." The smoky form of the entity began to expand, enveloping the entire clearing in darkness. Peter felt himself being lifted off his feet, suspended in a void that was both terrifying and oddly familiar. "Behold, Peter Holloway," the entity's voice echoed around him. "See the legacy you must uphold." Suddenly, Peter was assailed by a cascade of visions. He saw the forest as it had been millennia ago, pristine and untouched by human hands. He watched as the first guardian was chosen, a primitive human granted the power to communicate with the spirits of the land. The visions flashed forward through time. Peter witnessed countless guardians facing trials and tribulations, battling against forces that sought to exploit the forest's power. He felt their triumphs and their failures, their joys and their sorrows. "This is the burden you must bear," the entity intoned. "The weight of ages, the responsibility for all that lives within these bounds." As the last vision faded, Peter found himself back in the clearing, gasping for breath. The entity loomed over him, its glowing eyes searching. "Do you understand now, Peter Holloway, what it means to be a guardian?" Peter straightened, meeting the entity's gaze. "I'm beginning to," he said. "It's not just about protecting the trees and the animals. It's about maintaining a balance, preserving something ancient and powerful." The entity's form shifted, and Peter sensed what might have been approval. "You learn quickly. That will serve you well in the trials to come." "Trials?" Peter asked, a note of apprehension in his voice. "What kind of trials?" The entity's form began to coalesce, becoming more solid and defined. "The forest is under threat, young guardian. Dark forces seek to tap into its power to twist it to their own ends. You must stand against them, must become the shield that protects this sacred place. Peter's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of the task before him. But how? I'm just one person. I don't have any special powers or abilities. A tendril of smoke reached out, touching Peter's chest where the compass lay. You have more power than you know, Peter Holloway. The forest has chosen you, has awakened abilities that have lain dormant within you. You need only learn to harness them. As the smoky tendril touched him, Peter felt a surge of energy course through his body. For a brief moment, he could sense every living thing in the forest, could feel the ebb and flow of the ancient power that permeated this place. This is incredible, Peter breathed, overwhelmed by the sensation. The entity's form began to dissipate, spreading out to encompass the entire clearing. This is but a fraction of what you are capable of, young guardian. You must learn to control and direct this power if you hope to fulfill your duty. Peter nodded, a newfound determination filling him. I'm ready. Tell me what I need to do. The entity's voice grew fainter as its form became more diffuse. Seek out the ancient sites within the forest. Each holds a piece of the knowledge you will need. But be wary. You are not the only one searching for these places of power. As the last wisps of smoke faded away, Peter found himself alone in the clearing. But he was no longer the same man who had entered it. He could feel the forest's power thrumming through him, waiting to be tapped. Peter looked down at the compass in his hand, which now glowed with an inner light. All right, he said, his voice steady and resolute. Show me where to go next. The needle spun briefly before settling on a new direction. As Peter set off following its guidance, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The path ahead would be challenging, perhaps even dangerous. But he was no longer just Peter Holloway, lost hiker. He was a guardian of the forest, chosen to protect this sacred place against whatever threats might come. The trees seemed to whisper encouragement as he passed, their branches reaching out to brush against him in a gesture almost like a caress. Peter smiled, feeling truly at home for the first time since he'd entered this mystical wood. Don't worry, he said to the forest around him. I won't let you down. And with that promise echoing in the air, Peter ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in his new role as guardian. The forest had grown eerily quiet as Peter trekked deeper into its heart. The compass in his hand pulsed with a soft, otherworldly light, guiding him towards his next destination. As he walked, Peter couldn't shake the weight of the guardian entity's words. Seek out the ancient sites within the forest. Each holds a piece of the knowledge you will need. Peter muttered to himself. Ancient sites, huh? Couldn't be more specific, could you? As if in response to his sarcasm, the compass suddenly grew hot in his hand. Peter yelped, nearly dropping it. When he looked down, he saw that the needle was spinning wildly, faster than he'd ever seen it move before. Whoa, what's going on? He asked, holding the compass at arm's length. The spinning needle abruptly stopped, pointing decisively to Peter's right. Following its direction, Peter pushed through a thick curtain of vines and found himself in a small, circular clearing. At its center stood a weathered stone altar, covered in moss and ancient symbols. Peter approached cautiously, his heart pounding. As he neared the altar, the air around him seemed to thicken, charged with an energy he could almost taste. The compass in his hand vibrated, its glow intensifying. I guess this is one of those ancient sites, Peter said, reaching out to touch the altar. The moment his fingers made contact with the cool stone, the world around him exploded into light. Peter gasped as visions flooded his mind, glimpses of past guardians standing where he now stood, facing the same choice he was about to confront. A voice, neither male nor female, echoed in his head. Peter Holloway, you stand at a crossroads. The path of the guardian lies before you, but it comes at a great cost. Are you prepared to pay it? Peter swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. What kind of cost are we talking about here? The voice continued, unperturbed by his question. To truly become the guardian, you must leave behind your old life. Your memories, your connections to the world beyond this forest, all must be sacrificed for the greater good. Wait, what? Peter exclaimed, taking a step back from the altar. You're asking me to give up everything? My family, my friends, my entire identity? The forest requires complete devotion, the voice replied, a note of sorrow in its tone. To protect it, you must become one with it. Your human ties are a weakness that can be exploited by those who would do harm to this sacred place. Peter's mind reeled. He thought of his parents back in Seattle, probably worried sick about him by now. He thought of his friends, his job, the life he'd built for himself. Could he really give all that up? But then he remembered the feeling of connection he'd experienced with the forest, the sense of purpose that had filled him when the guardian entity had shown him the legacy he was meant to uphold. Was that worth sacrificing everything else? I don't know if I can make that choice, Peter said, his voice barely above a whisper. The voice responded, gentle but firm. You must, Peter Holloway. The forest has chosen you, but the final decision is yours. Embrace your destiny or walk away, but know that once the path is chosen, there is no return. Peter closed his eyes, trying to center himself. As he did, he became acutely aware of the forest around him. He could feel the life pulsing through every tree, every blade of grass. He sensed the ancient power that flowed through this place and the looming threats that sought to exploit it. Opening his eyes, Peter looked down at his hands. To his shock, he saw that his fingers had begun to transform, bark-like patterns spreading across his skin. "What's happening to me?" he cried out, panic rising in his chest. "The forest has already begun to claim you," the voice explained. "Your connection grows stronger with each passing moment, but it is not yet irreversible. You must choose, Peter Holloway, and choose now." Peter's mind raced. Could he really give up everything he'd ever known? But then again, could he walk away from this knowing what was at stake? As he wrestled with the decision, memories began to flood his mind. But they weren't just his memories. They were the collective experiences of all the guardians who had come before him. He saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, felt the joy of nurturing new life, and the pain of battling against those who would destroy it. These memories began to intertwine with his own, until Peter could barely distinguish between them. His life in Seattle began to feel distant, almost like a dream he was slowly waking from. I choose to stay," Peter said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose to become the guardian." The moment the words left his lips, Peter felt a profound shift within himself. The bark-like patterns on his skin spread rapidly, covering his entire body. But instead of panic, Peter felt a sense of peace wash over him. The voice spoke one last time. "You have chosen wisely, Peter Holloway. The forest welcomes you as its guardian. Your journey begins now." With those words, the visions faded, and Peter found himself back in the clearing. But everything looked different now. The colors were more vivid, the sounds clearer. He could feel the pulse of life in every living thing around him. Peter looked down at his hands, now fully transformed into a bark-like texture. He flexed his fingers, marveling at how natural it felt. "Well," he said to himself, a wry smile on his face. "I guess there's no going back now." As if in response, the trees around the clearing seemed to lean in, their leaves rustling in a symphony of welcome. Peter could understand their whispers now, could feel their joy at having a new guardian. But along with their welcome came a sense of urgency. Peter could feel the threats looming on the edges of the forest, dark forces seeking to exploit its power. "Don't worry," he said, addressing the forest at large. "I'm here now. I'll protect you." As the words left his mouth, Peter felt a surge of power course through him. The compass in his hand, which had gone dark after his transformation, suddenly blazed to life again. But now, instead of just pointing him in a direction, it showed him the entire forest, like a three-dimensional map hovering in the air. Peter could see the ancient sites scattered throughout the woods, each pulsing with its own unique energy. And he could see the dark spots too, areas where the forest's defenses were weakening. "All right," Peter said, a new determination in his voice. "Let's get to work." As he set off towards the nearest troubled spot, Peter felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness for the life he'd left behind, yes, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose and belonging he'd never experienced before. He was Peter Holloway, guardian of the forest, and he had a job to do. The trees parted before him as he walked, creating a path where none had existed before. Peter could feel the forest's power flowing through him, guiding him, strengthening him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. As he ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, Peter's transformation continued. His connection to the natural world grew stronger with each step, his human memories fading like mist in the morning sun. But he didn't mourn their loss. Instead, he embraced his new identity, ready to face whatever threats might come. The forest had chosen him, and he had chosen the forest. Now, it was time to fulfill his destiny as the guardian. The forest pulsed with an energy that Peter could now feel in every fiber of his being. His transformation into the guardian had heightened his senses beyond anything he could have imagined. The rustling of leaves, the scurrying of small creatures, even the slow growth of moss on the forest floor, all of it sang to him in a symphony of life. But amid this harmony, Peter sensed a discordant note. Something was wrong in the heart of the forest, a darkness that threatened the delicate balance he was sworn to protect. "Show me," Peter whispered to the compass, which now seemed more an extension of himself than a separate object. The compass glowed in response, projecting an ethereal map of the forest. A pulsing red spot caught Peter's attention, located in a part of the woods he hadn't yet explored. "That doesn't look good," he muttered, setting off in the direction of the disturbance. As Peter moved through the forest, he marveled at how his partially transformed body responded to his surroundings. His bark-like skin blended seamlessly with the trees, allowing him to move almost invisibly when he wished. His feet, now more root-like than human, gripped the earth with uncanny surety. But this new form also presented challenges. Peter found himself moving more slowly than before, each step deliberate and grounded. The forest's essence flowed through him, but it also anchored him to the earth in a way his human form never had. As he neared the location indicated by the compass, Peter began to hear unfamiliar sounds, the harsh clang of metal on stone, voices that didn't belong to the forest's usual inhabitants. Cautiously, he approached the edge of a small clearing. What he saw there made his sap run cold. A group of people, dressed in dark clothing adorned with strange symbols, were gathered around an ancient stone monolith. They were using tools to chip away at the stone, collecting the fragments in glowing containers. "Careful with that piece," one of them, apparently the leader, barked. "Each fragment contains immense power. We can't afford to waste any." Peter's mind raced. These must be the dark forces the guardian entity had warned him about. They were harvesting the forest's power, literally chipping away at its ancient protections. Without thinking, Peter stepped into the clearing. "Stop," he commanded, his voice resonating with the authority of the forest itself. The group turned as one, their eyes widening at the sight of Peter. His partially transformed body, neither fully human nor fully tree, was a shocking sight. The leader recovered first, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, what do we have here? The forest's new guardian, I presume." Peter stood his ground, drawing on the power of the forest to bolster his courage. "You're trespassing in a sacred place. Leave now, or face the consequences." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that grated against Peter's heightened senses. "Oh, we'll leave, Guardian, but not before we take what we came for." He turned to his companions. "Keep harvesting. I'll deal with this obstacle." As the others returned to their work, the leader approached Peter, pulling out a vial of sickly green liquid. "You're new to this, aren't you?" Allow me to educate you on the realities of your position." With a quick motion, he splashed the liquid at Peter. Where it touched his bark-like skin, Peter felt a searing pain. He cried out, stumbling backward. "A little concoction of our own," the leader sneered. "Designed specifically to harm beings like you. Still feeling confident, Guardian?" Peter gritted his teeth against the pain, his mind racing. He needed to stop these intruders, but how? In his partially transformed state, he was slower, more vulnerable than he'd realized. Panic began to set in. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't know how to use his new powers effectively. How could he hope to protect the forest when he could barely protect himself? As if sensing his distress, the forest itself seemed to respond. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their branches reaching out towards the intruders. Roots erupted from the ground, entangling the feet of those still working at the monolith. The leader's smug expression faltered. "What's happening? Quickly, gather what we have and let's go." Peter seized the moment of confusion. Concentrating hard, he tried to tap into the forest's power flowing through him. To his amazement, vines burst from the ground at his command, wrapping around the intruders and their equipment. "This is your last warning," Peter said, his voice stronger now. "Leave this place and never return." But even as he spoke, Peter could feel his control slipping. The effort of commanding the forest's power was draining him rapidly. His vision began to blur, his transformed body feeling heavier by the second. The leader noticed Peter's weakening state and laughed. "Impressive display, Guardian. But you're still new to this, aren't you? You don't have the stamina to maintain such power." With a gesture, the leader summoned dark energy that severed the vines holding him and his companions. "We're leaving, but don't think this is over. We'll be back, and next time, you won't catch us by surprise." As the intruders gathered their stolen fragments and fled, Peter sank to his knees, exhausted. He had driven them off, but at what cost? And they had still managed to take pieces of the ancient monolith with them. "I'm sorry," Peter whispered to the forest. "I failed you." A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it a sense of reassurance. The forest didn't blame him. He was still learning, still growing into his role. As Peter slowly regained his strength, he heard new sounds approaching, voices calling out, flashlights piercing the growing darkness. "Hello? Is anyone there? This is the search and rescue team." Peter's heart leapt. A search party. For a moment he was tempted to call out, to run towards the sound of human voices, but then he remembered he was no longer the Peter Holloway they were looking for. His old life was gone, sacrificed for his new role as guardian. With a heavy heart, Peter retreated deeper into the forest, using his newfound abilities to blend with the trees. He watched as the search party entered the clearing, their flashlights sweeping across the area he had occupied just moments before. "There's some kind of disturbance here," one of the searchers said, examining the ground. "Looks like there was some kind of struggle." "Any sign of the missing hiker?" another asked. "None. It's like he just vanished into thin air." As the search party continued their investigation, Peter felt a profound sense of loss. These were people from his old life, perhaps even friends, searching for someone who no longer existed. The Peter Holloway they knew was gone, replaced by the being he had become. Yet even as he mourned his old life, Peter felt his resolve strengthening. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. The forest needed him, and he had a lot to learn if he was going to be the guardian it deserved. As the search party's voices faded into the distance, Peter turned and walked deeper into the heart of the forest. The compass glowed softly in his hand, pointing him towards the next ancient site, the next piece of knowledge he needed to gain. "I may not be ready yet," Peter said to the forest around him, "but I will be. Whatever it takes, I'll learn to be the guardian you need." The trees seemed to whisper in response, their leaves rustling in a gesture almost like a caress. Peter smiled, feeling the forest's acceptance and encouragement flowing through him. With renewed determination, Peter set off into the depths of the woods. He had a long journey ahead of him, full of challenges and dangers, but he was no longer alone. He was part of something greater now, a vital piece in the ancient tapestry of the forest, and somewhere in the distance dark forces were gathering, preparing for their next assault on the forest's power. But when they returned, they would find a guardian ready to face them, a guardian who was one with the forest itself. The forest had grown darker, more primordial with each step Peter took. He could feel the ancient power thrumming through the earth, pulsing in sync with his own heartbeat. The compass in his hand glowed with an intensity that almost hurt to look at, guiding him unerringly towards his destination. As Peter pushed through a thick curtain of vines, he found himself back in the misty clearing where he had first encountered the guardian entity. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ethereal figures shimmered in and out of existence around the edges of the clearing, their forms flickering like candlelight. At the center stood the massive, smoky form of the guardian entity, its glowing eyes fixed on Peter. "Welcome back, young guardian," the entity's voice rumbled through the clearing. "You have grown much since we last met." Peter stepped forward, feeling the weight of his experiences in every movement. His partially transformed body, now more tree than human, creaked softly as he walked. "I've tried my best," Peter said, his voice carrying the whisper of rustling leaves. "But I fear it hasn't been enough. The dark forces, they're stronger than I anticipated." The guardian entity's form rippled, and Peter caught glimpses of ancient battles within its smoky depths. "The struggle between light and dark is as old as the forest itself, Peter Holloway. But now, it is time for you to understand the true nature of your role." With a gesture from the entity, the mist in the clearing coalesced into vivid, three-dimensional images. Peter watched in awe as the history of the forest unfolded before him. He saw the land as it was eons ago, raw and untamed. He witnessed the birth of the first trees, the emergence of the earliest creatures, and through it all, he sensed a presence, the nascent consciousness of the forest itself. "In the beginning," the guardian entity narrated, "there was no need for guardians. The forest was one with the earth, in perfect balance. But as time passed and the world changed, threats emerged. The images shifted, showing the arrival of the first humans. Peter saw their wonder at the forest's beauty, but also their fear of its mysteries. He watched as some sought to protect the woods, while others aimed to exploit its resources. It was then that the forest chose its first guardian, the entity continued. A human gifted with the ability to communicate with the forest and channel its power. This guardian protected the balance, standing against those who would do harm. Peter saw a succession of guardians through the ages, each facing unique challenges. He felt their triumphs and their sorrows, their moments of doubt and their unwavering dedication. "But why me?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not special. I was just a hiker who got lost." The guardian entity's eyes seemed to soften. "You were chosen, Peter Holloway, because of your innate connection to nature, your capacity for empathy, and your willingness to sacrifice for a greater good. The forest saw in you the potential to be more than you ever imagined." As the last images faded, Peter felt overwhelmed by the weight of the legacy he had inherited. "I want to live up to that choice," he said, straightening his shoulders. "But how can I stand against the dark forces when I barely understand my own powers?" The ethereal figures around the clearing began to move closer, their forms becoming more distinct. Peter gasped as he recognized them. They were the spirits of past guardians. One of them, a woman with leaves for hair and bark-like skin, stepped forward. "You are not alone in this fight, Peter Holloway. We are always here, our knowledge and strength a part of the forest itself." Another spirit, this one more tree than human, spoke next. "The power you seek is not something to be mastered, but something to be embraced. You must become one with the forest. Let its wisdom flow through you." Peter closed his eyes, focusing on the energy he could feel pulsing around him. He thought of every tree, every plant, every creature that called this forest home. He felt their lives, their needs, their fears. When he opened his eyes again, they glowed with an inner light. "I understand now," he said, his voice resonating with newfound power. "The forest isn't just something I protect. It's a part of me, as I am a part of it." The guardian entity nodded, approval radiating from its smoky form. "You learn quickly, young guardian. But be warned, the challenges ahead will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." As if summoned by these words, a cold wind swept through the clearing. The mist darkened, and Peter could sense a malevolent presence approaching. "They're coming," he said, tensing for battle. "The dark forces. They've found us." The guardian entity's form expanded, filling the clearing with swirling smoke. "Indeed they have. Are you ready to face them, Peter Holloway? To stand as the shield that protects this sacred place?" Peter took a deep breath, feeling the power of the forest surging through him. His body completed its transformation, becoming a perfect fusion of man and tree. "I'm ready," he said, his voice strong and sure. As the first wave of dark energy crashed against the edge of the clearing, Peter stepped forward to meet it. He raised his hands, channeling the forest's power into a barrier of pure green energy. The dark forces pushed against the barrier, their malevolent intent palpable. Peter gritted his teeth, pouring more of himself into the defense. He could feel the spirits of past guardians lending him their strength, their knowledge guiding his actions. "You cannot win, Guardian," a voice hissed from the darkness. "We are Legion, and we will not rest until we have claimed the forest's power for our own." Peter stood his ground, his resolve unshaken. "You don't understand," he called back. "The forest's power isn't something you can take or control. It's a living thing, and I am its voice, its protector." With a mighty effort, Peter pushed back against the dark energy. The forest responded to his call, roots erupting from the ground to entangle the unseen attackers, branches reaching out to bat away tendrils of darkness. The battle raged on, time losing all meaning as light struggled against dark. Peter lost himself in the ebb and flow of power, becoming a conduit for the forest's will. He felt pain as parts of the woods were corrupted by dark energy, felt joy as new growth sprang up to replace what was lost. Finally, after what could have been hours or days, the assault began to weaken. The dark forces, unable to break through the combined might of Peter and the forest, started to retreat. As the last wisps of malevolent energy faded away, Peter fell to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. The clearing was in shambles, the ground torn up and trees uprooted, but the forest as a whole had been saved. The guardian entity materialized beside him, its smoky form coalescing into a more solid shape. "You have done well, Peter Holloway. You have faced your first true test as guardian and emerged victorious." Peter looked up, a tired smile on his face. "We did it together," he said. "I couldn't have done it without the forest, without the spirits of the past guardians." The entity nodded, its glowing eyes warm with approval. "And that, young guardian, is the most important lesson of all. The strength of the forest lies in its unity, in the connections between all living things. As its guardian, you are the embodiment of that unity." As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Peter rose to his feet. He could feel the forest beginning to heal already, new growth springing up to replace what had been damaged in the battle. "What happens now?" Peter asked, looking out over the recovering woodland. The guardian entity's form began to dissipate, merging with the morning mist. "Now, Peter Holloway, your true work begins. The dark forces will return, and there are still many secrets of the forest for you to uncover. But for now, rest, recover. The forest will call upon you when you are needed." As the entity faded away, Peter felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He had faced his first great challenge as guardian and had emerged stronger for it. Whatever the future held, he knew he was ready to face it. With a contented sigh, Peter melded his form with a nearby tree, becoming one with the forest he had sworn to protect. As he drifted into a restorative slumber, he could hear the whispers of the woods around him, whispers of gratitude, of hope, and of the unbreakable bond between guardian and forest. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Yet Peter Holloway, once a lost hiker, and now the guardian of the forest, was prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The forest was his home, his purpose, his very being, and he would defend it with every fiber of his transformed existence. The moment I embraced my destiny, everything changed. My body, once solid and constrained, began to dissolve into the very essence of the forest. It wasn't painful. Rather, it felt like slipping into a warm bath after years of being parched. My consciousness expanded, flowing through every leaf, every root, every grain of soil in this ancient place. I gasped, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of sensations. Is this what it feels like to be everything? I whispered, my voice now carried by the rustling leaves. The guardian, a being of smoke and shadow, materialized beside me. Its voice resonated through the forest floor, a deep rumble that I felt more than heard. You are becoming one with the forest, as it was always meant to be. Your journey has only just begun. As the transformation continued, I witnessed flashes of my human life fading away. Memories of the city, of my job, of the people I once knew. They all seemed so distant now, like a dream upon waking. Yet I felt no sadness at their loss. Instead, a profound sense of belonging washed over me. The search, I murmured, suddenly remembering. They'll be looking for me. The guardian nodded, its smoky form shifting. Watch, it said simply. Through the expanded awareness of the forest, I saw them. Search parties combing through the undergrowth, calling my name. Their voices echoed through the trees, but they sounded muffled and distorted, as if coming from another world entirely. James, where are you? A woman's voice, filled with worry, pierced through the forest. I recognized her, Sarah, my sister. For a moment I felt a pang of guilt. I'm here. I tried to call out, but my voice was now the whisper of wind through leaves. Sarah paused, looking around. For a brief second, her eyes seemed to lock with mine, though I knew she couldn't truly see me. Did you hear that? She asked her companion. The man shook his head. Just the wind. Come on. We need to cover more ground before nightfall. I watched as they moved on, their flashlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Part of me wanted to reach out to let them know I was okay, but I knew that wasn't possible anymore. This was my world now. As night fell and the search was called off for the day, I felt the forest's rhythms change. Nocturnal creatures stirred, their life forces pulsing like stars in my newfound awareness. Owls took flight, bats emerged from their roosts, and small mammals scurried through the underbrush. You feel it all now, don't you? The guardian asked, its form glowing softly in the darkness. I nodded, marveling at the intricate web of life surrounding me. It's beautiful, I breathed. I never understood how alive everything is. The guardian's form rippled almost like a chuckle. This is just the beginning. Now you must learn to wield the forest's power. Time began to flow differently. What felt like moments to me were days in the human world. I watched as the search for my human self was gradually scaled back, then finally called off. I saw Sarah place a small memorial at the edge of the forest, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, I whispered, causing the leaves around her to rustle gently. She looked up, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossing her face before she turned and walked away for the last time. Seasons passed in the blink of an eye. I learned to extend my consciousness through every part of the forest, to feel the slow, steady growth of trees and the quick, vibrant lives of smaller plants. I communed with the animals, no longer separate, but part of the same great organism. The guardian taught me the ancient magics of the forest. I learned to control the weather, summoning rain when the land was parched or gentle breezes to spread seeds. I could speed the growth of plants, heal injured animals with a thought, and even alter the very landscape itself. Remember, the guardian cautioned as I raised a small mountain with a mere gesture. Our power comes with great responsibility. We protect and nurture, but we must also maintain balance. I nodded, carefully sculpting the new hill to blend seamlessly with the existing terrain. I understand. We're caretakers, not rulers. As my power grew, so did my understanding of the forest's history. I saw visions of past guardians, their lives and sacrifices woven into the very fabric of this place. I realized that my arrival had indeed been prophesied centuries ago, foreseen by the first guardian in a vision of the forest's future. The compass that had led me here revealed more of its secrets. It wasn't just a guide, but a key to unlocking the deepest, most primal magics of the forest. With it, I could peer through time itself, glimpsing possible futures and long-forgotten pasts. One day, or perhaps it was a year, time had little meaning now, I felt a new presence enter the forest. A hiker, young and full of life, stepped onto the worn path. There was something different about this one, a spark I recognized. You feel it too, don't you? The guardian materialized beside me, its smoky form contemplative. I nodded, my awareness focusing on the hiker. She has the potential, like I did. Perhaps, the guardian mused. The choice will be hers to make, as it was yours. I watched as the young woman made her way deeper into the forest. She moved with purpose, her eyes darting around as if searching for something she couldn't quite define. I knew that feeling all too well. What should I do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The guardian's form swirled, a mixture of approval and anticipation. You know the way. Guide her, test her, but remember, the choice must be hers alone. I extended my consciousness, feeling for a branch near the hiker's path. With a thought, I shaped it, molding the wood until a familiar object hung from its tip. The hiker paused, her gaze drawn to the gently swaying item. "What's this?" she murmured, reaching out to pluck the compass from the branch. As her fingers closed around it, I felt a surge of energy, the same energy that had changed my life forever. The compass needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that had nothing to do with magnetic north. "Hello?" the hiker called out, looking around nervously. "Is someone there?" I rustled the leaves gently, letting her feel the forest's awareness. "Welcome," I whispered. My voice carried on the wind. "Your journey begins now." The hiker's eyes widened, a mix of fear and excitement crossing her face. She looked down at the compass, then back up at the path before her. For a moment she hesitated, and I wondered if she would turn back. But then, with a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and stepped forward, following the compass's pull. "Okay," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "Let's see where this leads." As I watched her disappear deeper into the forest, I felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle was continuing, the forest's ancient magic finding a new potential guardian. Whatever challenges lay ahead for her, I would be there, guiding and protecting just as the guardian had done for me. The guardian's presence enveloped me, a comforting darkness that spoke of ancient wisdom. "You've done well," it said, pride evident in its tone. "Are you ready for what comes next?" I looked out over the vista of my forest, feeling the pulse of life in every leaf and stone. "I am," I replied, my voice the rustle of a million leaves. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As the sun set on another day in the eternal forest, I settled into my role as protector and guide, ready for whatever the future might bring. The compass had brought me home, and now it would do the same for another. The forest story continued, and I was now a part of its never-ending tale. The old Chevy groaned as Mark eased it onto the gravel road leading into Sequoia National Park. Lucy pressed her face against the passenger window, her eyes wide with childlike wonder as towering redwoods engulfed them. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows across the dashboard. "Can you believe we're finally here?" Lucy's voice brimmed with excitement. "After months of planning, we're actually doing this." Mark grinned, stealing a glance at his wife. Her enthusiasm was infectious, momentarily pushing away the nagging doubt that had been gnawing at him since they left San Francisco. "Yeah, it's pretty amazing, though I still think we should have gone with a hotel instead of camping." Lucy playfully swatted his arm. "Oh, come on. Where's your sense of adventure? This is going to be incredible, just you, me, and nature." "And bears," Mark added dryly. "Don't forget the bears." "Stop it," Lucy laughed. "You know the ranger said bear sightings are rare this time of year." As they rounded a bend, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. A weathered wooden sign proclaimed, "Welcome to Whispering Pines Campground." Mark pulled into the designated parking area, killing the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth. "Well, here we are," he announced, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Ready to rough it in the wild?" Lucy was already out of the car, stretching her arms above her head. "More than ready. Come on, let's find our spot and set up before it gets dark." They grabbed their gear from the trunk, a spacious tent, sleeping bags, cooler, and various camping supplies, and set off down a narrow trail. Their assigned campsite was near the back of the grounds, offering a bit more privacy than the others. As they walked, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind the trees. But there was nothing, just the endless sea of redwoods stretching as far as the eye could see. "Here we are." Lucy's voice snapped him back to reality. They had arrived at a small clearing, ringed by towering trees. A fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by a few weathered logs for seating. Mark dropped his load with a grunt. "Looks good. Let's get the tent up first." They worked together to set up their temporary home, Lucy reading the instructions while Mark wrestled with poles and fabric. Despite a few mishaps, including Mark nearly impaling himself on a tent stake, they managed to erect a respectable shelter. As Lucy arranged their sleeping bags inside the tent, Mark set about gathering firewood. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches, making his task easier than expected. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been dogging him since their arrival. Returning to the campsite, arms laden with wood, he found Lucy had finished setting up the interior of the tent and was now unpacking their cooler. "I thought we could do hot dogs and s'mores tonight," she said, holding up a package of Frank's. "Real gourmet camping cuisine." Mark chuckled, arranging the firewood in the pit. "Sounds perfect. Nothing says roughing it like processed meat on a stick." As the sun dipped below the tree line, Mark got the fire going. The flames cast a warm glow across the clearing, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Lucy produced a couple of camp chairs and they settled in, skewering hot dogs on long forks. "This is nice," Mark admitted, leaning back in his chair. The crackling fire and Lucy's presence were slowly easing his earlier tensions. "Maybe you were right about camping after all." Lucy beamed at him. "See? I told you. There's something magical about being out here, don't you think? It's like we're the only two people in the world." As if in response to her words, a gust of wind swept through the campsite, causing the fire to sputter and dance. And with it came a sound, so faint that Mark wasn't sure he'd actually heard it. "Did you hear that?" he asked, sitting up straight. Lucy frowned. "Hear what?" "I thought I heard." Mark trailed off, straining his ears, but there was nothing now except the pop and hiss of the fire. Never mind. Must have been the wind. But even as he said it, he wasn't convinced. It had sounded almost like a whisper, carried on the breeze. A single word, too indistinct to make out, but undeniably there. They finished their meal, topping it off with perfectly roasted marshmallows sandwiched between graham crackers and chocolate. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Lucy yawned widely. "I think it's time to turn in." she said, stretching. All that fresh air has worn me out. Mark nodded, dousing the remaining embers with water from their jug. As darkness enveloped the campsite, the forest seemed to press in around them. The once comforting sounds of nature took on a more sinister tone in the pitch black. Inside the tent, they snuggled into their sleeping bags. Lucy was asleep within minutes, her soft breathing a counterpoint to the various night sounds filtering through the thin fabric walls. Mark, however, lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent his imagination into overdrive. He tried to rationalize his unease. It was just new surroundings, perfectly normal to feel a bit on edge. Just as he was finally drifting off, a sound jolted him fully awake. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding in his chest. It had been close, too close, like something moving just outside the tent. Slowly, carefully, Mark sat up. Lucy stirred, but didn't wake. He held his breath, listening intently. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, unmistakably, he saw it. A shadow passing across the side of the tent. Human-shaped, but somehow wrong. Too tall, too thin. It paused for a heartbeat, and Mark could have sworn he heard that whisper again, clearer this time, but still unintelligible. As quickly as it appeared, the shadow was gone. Mark sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Minutes ticked by, but nothing further happened. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and Mark sank back down into his sleeping bag. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought circled in his mind. What had he seen? And more importantly, what had they gotten themselves into? The first light of dawn found Mark bolt upright in the tent, the events of the night crystal clear in his mind. But as he looked around at the peaceful campsite, Lucy still sleeping soundly beside him, he began to doubt. In the warm morning light, it all seemed like a product of an overactive imagination, fueled by unfamiliar surroundings and too many campfire stories. Just a dream, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his tousled hair. It was just a dream. But even as he said it, a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that something wasn't quite right, that their peaceful camping trip was about to become anything but. Little did Mark know, this was only the beginning. The true horrors of Whispering Pines campground were yet to reveal themselves. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of towering sequoias, dappling the forest floor with patches of golden light. Mark and Lucy emerged from their tent, stretching and yawning as they breathed in the crisp mountain air. "Sleep well?" Lucy asked, flashing Mark a bright smile as she rummaged through their cooler for breakfast supplies. Mark hesitated, the memory of last night's shadowy figure still fresh in his mind. "Yeah, fine," he lied, not wanting to worry her. "How about you?" "Like a log," Lucy replied. "I swear the air out here is better than any sleeping pill." As Lucy busied herself with preparing a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, Mark found his gaze drawn to the surrounding forest. In the light of day, it seemed almost impossibly beautiful, the massive trunks of the sequoias stretching endlessly skyward. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. "I was thinking we could go for a hike today," Lucy said, handing Mark a steaming mug of coffee. The ranger at the entrance mentioned some beautiful trails nearby. Mark nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Sounds good. Let's gear up after breakfast." An hour later, they set off down one of the marked trails, a winding path that promised spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness. The hike started pleasantly enough, with Lucy pointing out various plants and birds she recognized from her guidebook. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Mark suddenly stopped short. "Wait," he said, holding out an arm to halt Lucy. "Do you see that?" Just off the path, partially obscured by overgrown ferns, stood an old, weather-beaten sign. The wood was gray and splintered with age, the paint faded and peeling. But the words were still legible, sending a chill down Mark's spine. "Danger, do not enter. Site of the Whispering Pines tragedy. May those lost here rest in peace." Lucy frowned, stepping closer to examine the sign. Whispering Pines tragedy? I don't remember reading anything about that in the guidebook. Mark shook his head, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Neither do I, but it doesn't sound good. They stood in silence for a moment, the cheerful bird song suddenly seeming out of place in the shadow of this ominous warning. Maybe we should head back, Mark suggested, unable to shake his growing unease, but Lucy's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Are you kidding? This is fascinating. We have to find out more about this tragedy. Come on, let's finish the hike and then we can ask around at the ranger station. Reluctantly, Mark agreed, and they continued their hike. But the discovery of the sign had cast a pall over their outing. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig set Mark's nerves on edge. They returned to their campsite in the early afternoon, and after a quick lunch, drove to the ranger station. The small wooden building stood at the entrance to the park, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Inside, they found a young ranger named Tom manning the desk. His eyes lit up at the sight of visitors, clearly eager for some company. Well, hello there, he greeted them cheerfully. How are you folks enjoying your stay at Whispering Pines? It's beautiful, Lucy replied. But we came across something strange on our hike today. An old sign mentioning a Whispering Pines tragedy. We were hoping you could tell us more about it. The smile fell from Tom's face, replaced by a look of surprise, and something that might have been fear. Oh, he said, his voice noticeably less enthusiastic. That old thing. I thought we'd taken down all those signs years ago. Mark leaned forward, intrigued despite his apprehension. So there was a tragedy. What happened? Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to ensure no one else was listening. It's not something we like to talk about much, he said in a low voice. Bad for tourism, you know. But I suppose you have a right to know, camping out there and all. He reached under the desk and pulled out a battered old ledger. This contains newspaper clippings and reports from the time, he explained, flipping through the yellowed pages. It happened about 50 years ago. A group of campers, 2 couples and their kids, went missing in the area where you're staying now. Lucy gasped softly. Missing? Were they ever found? Tom shook his head grimly. Not a trace. Search parties combed the area for weeks. They found the campsite untouched, food still on the table, tent still up. But of the campers themselves, nothing. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, remembering the shadow he'd seen the night before. Was there any explanation? Wild animals, maybe? Nothing conclusive, Tom replied. There were theories, of course, everything from bear attacks to alien abductions. But in the end, it remained a mystery. The area was closed off for years afterward, but eventually the park reopened it. People forgot or chose to forget. Lucy leaned in, examining the old newspaper clippings. The headlines screamed of the disappearances, the photos showing smiling families who had no idea of the fate that awaited them. This is incredible, she murmured. Tragic, of course, but fascinating from a historical perspective. Mark, however, felt his unease growing. Maybe we should think about moving to a different campsite, he suggested. Lucy looked at him in surprise. What? Why? This just makes it more interesting. I don't know, Mark said, struggling to articulate his feelings of dread. It just feels wrong somehow, camping there after learning about this. Tom interjected, his voice taking on an almost rehearsed quality. I can assure you, the area is perfectly safe now. We've had countless campers stay there over the years without incident. What happened 50 years ago was a tragic anomaly. Lucy nodded, seemingly reassured. See, Mark? There's nothing to worry about. We can't let an old tragedy spook us. Outnumbered, Mark reluctantly agreed to stay. They thanked Tom for the information and headed back to their campsite, Lucy chattering excitedly about the historical significance of their discovery. As night fell, they sat around the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Lucy was still engrossed in the story of the missing campers, theorizing about what might have happened to them. Maybe they got lost and couldn't find their way back, she mused. Or perhaps there was some kind of natural disaster, a landslide or something that we don't know about. Mark nodded absently, his attention focused on the darkness beyond their little circle of light. The forest seemed more alive tonight, filled with whispers and movements just at the edge of perception. Suddenly a scream pierced the night, causing both of them to jump. It was distant but unmistakable, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the trees before abruptly cutting off. "What was that?" Lucy whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Mark was on his feet, peering into the darkness. "I don't know," he said, his heart pounding. "Maybe another camper, or an animal." But deep down, he knew it was neither of those things. The scream had been too human, too agonized to be anything natural. And as they huddled together by the fire, straining their ears for any further sounds, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something far more sinister than a simple camping trip. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, both of them too unnerved to sleep. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Mark made a decision. "We need to investigate," he said, his voice hoarse from the sleepless night. "Whatever that scream was, we can't just ignore it." Lucy nodded, her earlier excitement replaced by grim determination. "You're right. We have to know what's going on here." As they prepared to venture into the forest, neither of them spoke the thought that hung heavy in the air. Had they just heard the echo of a 50-year-old tragedy? And if so, what did that mean for them? With flashlights in hand and hearts pounding, they set off into the woods, unaware that they were walking into a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality itself. The pre-dawn forest was shrouded in mist, the tall sequoias looming like silent sentinels in the gray light. Mark's eyes snapped open, his heart racing as he jolted awake. Something was wrong, very wrong. He reached out, expecting to feel Lucy's warmth beside him, but his hand met only the cool fabric of her empty sleeping bag. Panic surged through him as he sat up, fumbling for the flashlight. "Lucy!" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness of the tent. No response. Unzipping the tent with shaking hands, Mark stumbled out into the campsite. The embers of last night's fire glowed faintly, wisps of smoke curling into the air. But of Lucy, there was no sign. "Lucy!" he shouted, louder this time. The sound seemed to be swallowed by the fog, muffled and distant. "Lucy, where are you?" Mark's mind raced, remembering the scream they'd heard the night before. Had something happened to her? Had she wandered off in the night? The possibilities, each more terrifying than the last, flooded his thoughts. He was about to head back to the tent for his phone when he heard it. A scream. Lucy's scream. It came from deeper in the forest, filled with terror and pain. Without a second thought, Mark plunged into the woods, following the sound. Branches whipped at his face as he ran. Roots threatened to trip him, but he pushed on, driven by fear and desperation. "Lucy, I'm coming!" he yelled, hoping his voice would reach her, would give her hope. The scream came again, closer this time. Mark changed direction, crashing through a thick patch of ferns. As he emerged on the other side, he found himself at the edge of a steep ravine. And there, at the bottom, was Lucy. She was sprawled on the rocky ground, her pajamas torn and dirty. As Mark's flashlight beam fell on her, she looked up, her face a mask of pain and relief. "Mark, thank God," she called up to him. I fell. I think my ankle's broken." Mark's relief at finding her alive was tempered by the realization of how precarious her situation was. The sides of the ravine were steep and slippery with moss. Getting down to her, and more importantly, getting her out, would be challenging. "Hold on, Lucy," he shouted down. "I'm going to find a way down to you. Just stay still, okay?" She nodded, wincing as she tried to move. Mark began to make his way carefully down the slope, using roots and rocks as handholds. It was slow going, and more than once he nearly lost his footing on the treacherous surface. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, he reached the bottom of the ravine. Lucy threw her arms around him as he knelt beside her, her body shaking with sobs. "Shh, it's okay," he murmured, holding her close. "I've got you. You're safe now." When she had calmed a bit, Mark examined her ankle. It was swollen and bruised, but he couldn't tell if it was broken or just badly sprained. "What happened?" he asked gently. "How did you end up out here?" Lucy shook her head, confusion evident in her eyes. I don't know. I woke up and I was walking. It was like something was calling me, and then I was falling." A chill ran down Mark's spine at her words. "Something was calling you? What do you mean?" "I don't know," Lucy said, frustration creeping into her voice. "It was like a dream. I could hear whispers, see shapes in the mist. And then I was here, and everything hurt." Mark frowned, remembering the whispers he thought he'd heard their first night. But before he could pursue that line of thought, he noticed Lucy shivering in the cool morning air. "We need to get you out of here," he said, looking up at the steep slope. "Do you think you can climb if I help you?" Lucy nodded determinedly. "I'll try." The ascent was slow and painful. Mark went first, pulling Lucy up after him. Every few feet they had to stop to rest, Lucy's face growing paler with each pause. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the top. They stumbled back to the campsite, Lucy leaning heavily on Mark. As they emerged from the trees, both of them stopped short, staring in disbelief. Their tent was in tatters, ripped to shreds as if by some wild animal. The contents of their backpacks were strewn across the clearing, clothes and supplies scattered everywhere. What happened?" Lucy whispered, her eyes wide with shock. Mark shook his head, unable to comprehend the scene before them. "I don't know. It was fine when I left to find you. This isn't possible." They approached cautiously, Mark's eyes darting around for any sign of what could have done this. But there were no tracks, no claw marks, nothing to indicate what had ransacked their camp. As they began to clean up, gathering what they could salvage, Mark noticed something that made his blood run cold. On several of the trees surrounding their campsite, strange symbols had been carved into the bark. They looked ancient, like no writing system he'd ever seen before. "Lucy," he called, his voice tight. "Come look at this." She limped over, gasping when she saw the symbols. "What are they? Were they here before?" Mark shook his head. "No, definitely not. I would have noticed them." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. The fall, the destroyed campsite, these mysterious symbols. It was all too much to be coincidence. "Mark," Lucy said finally, her voice small and frightened. "I don't think we should stay here. Something's not right." He nodded, already moving to pack up what remained of their belongings. "You're right. We'll head back to town, get your ankle looked at, and figure out our next move from there." As they worked, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees with an almost mournful sound. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, always disappearing when they turned to look directly at them. And underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakably there, were the whispers. Words just beyond understanding, carrying a sense of urgency and desperation. They finished packing in record time, both of them eager to be away from this place that had so quickly turned from a peaceful retreat to a nightmare. As Mark helped Lucy to the car, she suddenly stopped, her face draining of color. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark listened, and there it was again, the whispers, louder now, almost forming words. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he could almost understand what they were saying. "Let's go," he said urgently, practically lifting Lucy into the passenger seat. "We need to get out of here. Now." As he started the engine, Mark caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. For just a second, he could have sworn he saw figures standing at the edge of the clearing, translucent, shimmering forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. He gunned the engine, tires spinning on the gravel as they sped away from the campsite. In the passenger seat, Lucy was pale and shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening, Mark?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did we see back there?" Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we might have stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see. Something old and dangerous." As they drove away from Whispering Pines campground, neither of them spoke. But the whispers lingered in their minds, and the feeling that they were being watched, that something had followed them, refused to fade. They had escaped for now, but deep down both Mark and Lucy knew that this was far from over. Whatever had begun in those woods, whatever force had tried to claim them, it wasn't going to let them go easily. And as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the morning mist, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were driving not towards safety, but into an even greater unknown. The small-town hospital buzzed with quiet activity as Mark paced the waiting room, his mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours on an endless loop. Lucy was behind closed doors, getting her ankle examined and x-rayed. The adrenaline of their escape had worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a gnawing fear that refused to subside. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jennings, your wife is ready to see you now." Mark followed her down a sterile hallway to a small examination room. Lucy sat on the edge of the bed, her injured ankle wrapped in a compression bandage. Her face brightened as he entered, but he could see the lingering fear in her eyes. "What's the verdict?" he asked, taking her hand. "Just a bad sprain, thankfully," Lucy replied. "The doctor wants me to stay off it for a few days, but no lasting damage." Mark breathed a sigh of relief. "That's good news. I was worried." He trailed off, unable to voice the myriad of terrifying scenarios that had been running through his mind. Lucy squeezed his hand, understanding without words. "I know," she said softly. "Me too." The doctor entered then, a kindly older man with salt and pepper hair and a reassuring smile. "Mrs. Jennings, you're free to go. Just remember to rest, ice, and elevate that ankle. And maybe be a bit more careful on your hikes, eh?" Lucy and Mark exchanged a glance. How could they explain that a simple hike was the least of what had happened? As they left the hospital, leaning on each other for support, both physical and emotional, Mark broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said. "What happened to us? It wasn't natural." Lucy nodded, her expression grim. "I agree. But where do we start? It's not like we can just Google supernatural camping experience and get answers." Mark thought for a moment. "The ranger station," he said finally. "Tom seemed to know more about the history of Whispering Pines than he let on. Maybe if we press him, he'll give us some real answers." They made their way back to the ranger station, the cheerful facade now seeming ominous in light of their experiences. Tom looked up as they entered, his friendly smile faltering slightly at their serious expressions. "Folks, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Everything all right with your camping trip?" Mark leaned on the counter, his voice low and intense. "No, Tom, everything is not all right. We need to know the truth about Whispering Pines. The whole truth." Tom's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of resigned weariness. He glanced around the empty station before speaking. "I was afraid of this," he sighed. "Come with me." He led them to a small back office, closing the door behind them. From a locked drawer, he pulled out a thick file folder, its edges worn and yellowed with age. "This contains everything we know about the incidents at Whispering Pines," Tom explained, spreading the contents across his desk. "Not just the disappearances 50 years ago, but other stranger occurrences over the years." Lucy leaned in, her eyes widening as she scanned the documents. "These go back over a century," she breathed. "Disappearances, unexplained phenomena, sightings of spirits?" Tom nodded grimly. "The locals have always known there was something off about those woods. The native tribes avoided the area entirely, called it a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Mark's mind raced, trying to reconcile this information with what they'd experienced. But why keep it open? Why let people camp there if you know it's dangerous? Tom spread his hands helplessly. Tourism dollars mostly. And for years, nothing major happened. A few odd experiences here and there, but nothing concrete. Until you two. Lucy looked up sharply. What do you mean, until us? Tom hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Your experience. It matches some of the older accounts. The whispers, the sense of being watched, the strange symbols. It's like whatever's out there is becoming more active. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. What is out there, Tom? What are we dealing with? Honestly, we don't know, Tom admitted. Some think it's restless spirits, others believe it's something older, more primal. A few of the really old accounts even mention entities, things that aren't quite human but not quite spirit either. Lucy's hand found Mark's, gripping it tightly. So what do we do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked at them both, his expression grave. If I were you, I'd leave. Get as far away from here as you can and try to forget what you saw. But even as he said it, Mark knew it wasn't an option. The memory of those whispers, the fleeting glimpses of otherworldly figures, the symbols carved into the trees, they were etched into his mind, impossible to ignore or forget. We can't just leave, he said firmly. Whatever's happening, we're part of it now. We need to understand it. Lucy nodded in agreement. Maybe we can help. Stop whatever's happening before anyone else gets hurt. Tom looked at them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I was afraid you'd say that. But I understand. If you're determined to see this through, there's someone you should talk to. He scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Mark. Old Mrs. Abernathy. She's lived here her whole life, knows more about the history of this place than anyone. If anyone can help you make sense of what's happening, it's her. As they left the ranger station, armed with the file and Mrs. Abernathy's address, Mark felt a strange mix of fear and determination. They were diving headfirst into something beyond their understanding, something potentially dangerous. But the alternative, walking away, leaving the mystery unsolved, was unthinkable. Are you sure about this? He asked Lucy as they got into their car. We could still leave. Try to put this all behind us. Lucy looked at him, her eyes filled with a steely resolve that matched his own. We're in this together, Mark. Whatever's happening, whatever we're up against, we'll face it side by side. As they drove towards Mrs. Abernathy's house, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road. And in those shadows, just at the edge of perception, shapes seemed to move and flicker, as if the barrier between their world and another was growing thinner by the moment. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing with questions. What were they truly up against? Could they hope to understand it, let alone stop it? And most chillingly, had their inadvertent intrusion into Whispering Pines set something in motion that couldn't be undone? As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were driving not just towards answers, but towards a confrontation with forces beyond their wildest imagination. Whatever lay ahead, he knew their lives would never be the same again. The roads twisted and turned as they made their way deeper into the heart of the small town, the address Tom had given them leading them to an older, more secluded area. As they pulled up to a weathered Victorian house, its paint peeling and garden overgrown, Mark and Lucy exchanged a nervous glance. This is it, Mark said, killing the engine. Ready? Lucy nodded, her face set with determination. As ready as I'll ever be. Together they approached the front door, the old porch boards creaking ominously under their feet. Before they could knock, the door swung open, revealing a tiny, wizened woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through them. I've been expecting you, Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone of her advanced years. Come in, Come in. We have much to discuss, and precious little time. As they stepped over the threshold, both Mark and Lucy felt a strange sensation wash over them, as if they were crossing more than just a physical boundary. Whatever answers they sought, they were about to delve deeper into the mystery of Whispering Pines than they ever could have imagined. The interior of Mrs. Abernathy's house was a cluttered maze of antiques, books, and curious artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old paper. Mark and Lucy followed the elderly woman into a dimly lit sitting room, where she gestured for them to take a seat on a worn velvet sofa. "Tea?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, already moving towards an ornate silver tea set. "Yes, please," Lucy replied, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the strange symbols and diagrams that adorned the walls. As Mrs. Abernathy busied herself with the tea, Mark leaned in close to Lucy. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered. "She seems a bit eccentric." Lucy squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We need answers, Mark, and right now, she's our best shot at getting them." Mrs. Abernathy returned, carefully balancing a tray with 3 steaming cups. As she handed them their tea, her piercing gaze seemed to look right through them. "Now then," she said, settling into a high-backed armchair across from them, "tell me everything that happened at Whispering Pines. Leave nothing out, no matter how strange or impossible it may seem." Mark and Lucy took turns recounting their experiences. The whispers, the shadows, Lucy's inexplicable sleepwalking, and the strange symbols carved into the trees. As they spoke, Mrs. Abernathy's expression grew increasingly grave. When they finished, she set down her teacup with a soft clink. "It's worse than I feared," she murmured, almost to herself. "The veil is thinning faster than ever before." "The veil?" Mark asked, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Abernathy sighed, her eyes taking on a faraway look. "There are places in this world where the boundary between our reality and others is not as solid as we'd like to believe. Whispering Pines is one such place. For centuries it has been a nexus point, a crossroads between worlds." Lucy's grip on Mark's hand tightened. "Are you saying we saw ghosts?" "If only it were that simple," Mrs. Abernathy replied, shaking her head. "What you encountered were entities far older and more powerful than mere spirits of the dead. They are beings that exist in the spaces between realities, always seeking a way to cross over into our world." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "But why? What do they want?" Mrs. Abernathy's expression darkened. "To exist here, in our reality, to feed on the energy of the living, and with each passing year, as more people forget the old ways and the old protections, their influence grows stronger." A heavy silence fell over the room as Mark and Lucy tried to process this information. It seemed impossible, like something out of a horror movie. And yet, after what they had experienced, they couldn't simply dismiss it. "So what can we do?" Lucy asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward, her eyes glinting with a mix of fear and determination. "We must try to communicate with them, to understand their intentions. And then, perhaps, we can find a way to strengthen the veil and push them back." Mark shook his head, disbelief warring with the undeniable reality of their situation. "How? How can we possibly communicate with entities from another reality?" "There are ways," Mrs. Abernathy said. Rising from her chair with surprising agility, she moved to a large wooden cabinet and began rummaging through its contents. "Ancient methods of crossing the boundaries between worlds, if only for a moment. But I warn you, it is not without risk." She returned with an ornate silver bowl and a small vial of dark liquid. "This is a mixture of herbs and other ingredients that can open the mind to communication with the other side. But be warned, once the connection is established, the entities may try to use it to their advantage." Lucy and Mark exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. Despite the danger, they both knew they couldn't turn back now. "I'll do it," Lucy said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. I've already had some kind of connection with them. Maybe I can reach them again." Mark started to protest, but Lucy silenced him with a look. "It has to be me, Mark. We both know it." Mrs. Abernathy nodded approvingly. "Brave girl. Now lie back and try to relax. When I apply this mixture to your forehead, you may feel a sensation of falling or floating. Don't fight it. Let it carry you to where you need to go." As Lucy reclined on the sofa, Mark hovering anxiously nearby, Mrs. Abernathy began to chant in a language neither of them recognized. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the shadows in the corners growing deeper. With a steady hand, Mrs. Abernathy applied a small amount of the dark liquid to Lucy's forehead. Almost immediately, Lucy's body went rigid, her eyes rolling back in her head. "Lucy!" Mark cried, reaching for her. Mrs. Abernathy held him back with surprising strength. "No, you mustn't break the connection. She's crossing over now." Lucy's breathing became rapid and shallow, her body trembling slightly. Mark watched in helpless fear as minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Suddenly, Lucy's eyes snapped open, but they were different, unfocused, seeing something beyond the confines of the room. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. "We are the Watchers," Lucy intoned, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "We have waited long for this moment." Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward, her face a mask of concentration. "Why have you come to our world? What do you seek?" Lucy's head turned, those unseeing eyes seeming to focus on Mrs. Abernathy. "We seek existence. Your world is rich with energy, with life. We hunger for it." "You can't have it," Mark said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "This is our world, not yours." A chilling laugh emanated from Lucy's lips. "Your world? Foolish mortal. All worlds are connected. The boundaries between them are not walls but doors, and we have found the key." Mrs. Abernathy's face paled. "The symbols," she whispered. "The carvings on the trees. They're not just markings, they're—" "A bridge," Lucy's possessed voice confirmed. "With each symbol, the veil weakens. Soon, it will tear completely, and we will cross over fully." "We won't let that happen," Mark said, trying to inject confidence into his voice despite the terror gripping his heart. The entity laughed again. "You cannot stop what has already begun. Even now, more of us slip through. We will take this world, and all who dwell in it will serve as our vessels." With a sudden violent motion, Lucy's body arched off the sofa, a scream tearing from her throat. Her eyes rolled back, and she began to convulse. "Lucy!" Mark cried, rushing to her side. "Mrs. Abernathy, do something!" The old woman was already moving, grabbing a handful of some herbs from a nearby bowl and casting them into the air. She began to chant again, her voice rising in volume and intensity. The air in the room seemed to pulse, the shadows retreating as if burned by an unseen light. With a final, gut-wrenching cry, Lucy's body went limp. For a heart-stopping moment, she lay motionless. Then, with a gasp, her eyes flew open, her own eyes this time filled with confusion and fear. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. What happened?" As Mark gathered Lucy into his arms, relief washing over him, Mrs. Abernathy sank back into her chair, looking exhausted. "We've made contact," she said grimly, "but I fear we've only scratched the surface of what we're truly facing. The entities, these Watchers, are more powerful and more determined than I ever imagined." Mark looked up from where he was cradling Lucy. "So what do we do now?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Now, we prepare for war. The battle for our world has begun, and we are on the front lines." As the gravity of their situation settled over them, Mark and Lucy clung to each other, both knowing that their lives had irrevocably changed. Whatever came next, they would face it together, standing against the encroaching darkness that threatened to engulf not just Whispering Pines, but the entire world. The drive back to their hotel was silent, the weight of what they had learned pressing down on Mark and Lucy like a physical force. The streets of the small town seemed eerily quiet, the shadows deeper and more menacing than before. As they pulled into the hotel parking lot, Lucy suddenly gasped, grabbing Mark's arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing towards their room. For a split second, Mark saw it too, a dark, shimmering figure standing by their door. But as he blinked, it vanished, leaving him unsure if it had been real or just a trick of the light. "Did you see that?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded grimly. "Yeah, I did. Come on, let's get inside. I don't like being out in the open right now." They hurried to their room, Mark fumbling with the key card as Lucy kept watch. Once inside, they both let out a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. "Okay," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "We need to figure out our next move. Mrs. Abernathy said we need to prepare, but how do we prepare for this?" Lucy sank onto the bed, wincing slightly as she adjusted her injured ankle. "I don't know, Mark. This is so far beyond anything we've ever dealt with. Maybe we should just leave. Get as far away from here as we can." Mark was about to agree when a sudden chill ran down his spine. He turned slowly, his eyes widening as he saw the pen on the bedside table begin to roll, seemingly of its own accord. "Lucy," he said softly, not taking his eyes off the pen. "Don't move." The pen continued to roll, picking up speed until it fell off the table with a clatter. In the silence that followed, they could hear it, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. Lucy stood up slowly, moving to stand beside Mark. "They followed us," she said, her voice barely audible. "What do we do?" Before Mark could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath fogged in the air as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners, writhing and pulsing with an otherworldly energy. "We need to leave," Mark said, grabbing Lucy's hand. "Now!" They rushed for the door, but as Mark reached for the handle, an invisible force slammed him backward. He crashed into Lucy, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The whispers had become a cacophony now, 100 voices speaking in languages long forgotten. The shadows coalesced, forming vaguely humanoid shapes that loomed over them. "Mark," Lucy screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" Mark scrambled to his feet, pulling Lucy up with him. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. We need to find a way out." As if in response to his words, objects began to fly around the room. Books, lamps, anything not nailed down became projectiles hurled by unseen hands. Mark and Lucy ducked and weaved, desperately trying to avoid being hit. "The bathroom!" Lucy shouted over the din. "Maybe we can barricade ourselves in." They made a run for it, slamming the bathroom door shut behind them, just as a heavy vase smashed against it. Mark braced himself against the door, feeling it shudder as more objects pummeled it from the other side. "What now?" Lucy asked, her voice shaking. "We can't stay in here forever." Mark's mind raced, trying to remember everything Mrs. Abernathy had told them. "Salt," he suddenly exclaimed. "She said salt can repel spirits. Do we have any?" Lucy rummaged through her toiletry bag, triumphantly producing a small container of bath salts. "Will this work?" "It'll have to," Mark replied. "Okay, here's the plan. I'm going to open the door. You throw the salt at whatever's out there, and we make a run for it. Ready?" Lucy nodded, clutching the container tightly. "Ready?" Mark took a deep breath, then yanked the door open. The scene that greeted them was like something out of a nightmare. The room was in chaos, furniture overturned, and in the center of it all stood 3 shadowy figures, their forms flickering and distorting in ways that hurt the eyes to look at. "Now!" Mark yelled. Lucy threw the salt with all her might. As it hit the shadowy figures, they recoiled with an unearthly shriek. The assault of flying objects ceased immediately. "Run!" Mark grabbed Lucy's hand and they bolted for the door. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, he floored the accelerator, tires squealing as they peeled out of the parking lot. "Where are we going?" Lucy asked, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Back to Mrs. Abernathy's," Mark replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "She's the only one who might know how to stop this." As they drove, the night seemed to press in around them. Shadows flickered at the edge of the headlight's reach, and more than once Mark had to swerve to avoid what looked like figures standing in the middle of the road. "They're everywhere," Lucy whispered, her eyes darting from side to side. "Mark, I don't think we can escape them." Mark reached over and squeezed her hand. "We're not trying to escape, Lucy. We're going to fight back. Whatever these things are, they're not invincible. We hurt them with the salt, remember?" Lucy nodded, taking a deep breath. "You're right, we can't give up. But Mark, what if Mrs. Abernathy can't help us? What if there's no way to stop this?" Before Mark could respond, the car's engine suddenly sputtered and died. They coasted to a stop in the middle of the deserted road, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. "No, no, no," Mark muttered, turning the key repeatedly. The engine wouldn't even turn over. "This isn't possible. The car was fine earlier." A tapping sound on the passenger window made them both jump. Lucy let out a strangled gasp as she saw what was outside. A pale, distorted face pressed against the glass, its mouth moving in silent words. "Mark," she whimpered, shrinking away from the window. More faces appeared surrounding the car. Their features were blurred and shifting as if they couldn't quite maintain a solid form in this reality. The tapping increased, becoming a thunderous pounding that shook the entire vehicle. "What do we do?" Lucy cried, covering her ears against the deafening noise. Mark looked around frantically, searching for any means of escape. His eyes fell on Lucy's purse, and a desperate idea formed. "Your phone!" he shouted over the noise. "Call Mrs. Abernathy." Lucy fumbled with her purse, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. To their relief, it still had signal. She quickly dialed the number Mrs. Abernathy had given them. As the phone rang, the pounding intensified. Cracks began to appear in the windshield. Please pick up," Lucy chanted, her voice rising in panic. Just as the windshield was about to shatter, Mrs. Abernathy's voice came through the speaker. "Hello?" "Mrs. Abernathy," Lucy cried. "We need help. They're here. They've surrounded us. We can't—" "Listen carefully," Mrs. Abernathy cut in, her voice urgent. "Repeat after me. By the power of earth and sky, of spirit and flesh, I command you to depart." Lucy and Mark began to chant the words, their voices joining together as the onslaught outside reached a fever pitch. As they finished the incantation, a blinding light erupted from the center of the car, expanding outward in a shockwave that sent the entities reeling. In an instant, the road was clear. The pounding stopped, the faces vanished, and an eerie silence descended. It worked, Lucy breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "For now," Mrs. Abernathy's voice came through the phone. "But this is far from over. You need to get here as soon as possible. We have much to do, and very little time." As if on cue, the car's engine suddenly roared to life. Mark wasted no time, putting it in gear and speeding off towards Mrs. Abernathy's house. As they drove, both Mark and Lucy knew that they had just experienced a turning point. The entities were growing bolder, more powerful. The barrier between worlds was weakening by the minute. Whatever came next, they knew one thing for certain. The real battle was just beginning, and the fate of not just Whispering Pines but possibly the entire world hung in the balance. The old Victorian house loomed before them, its weathered facade a stark contrast to the modern world they had left behind. Mark and Lucy stumbled out of the car, exhausted and shaken from their ordeal. Before they could even reach the porch, the front door swung open, revealing Mrs. Abernathy's worried face. "Quickly," she urged, ushering them inside. "We don't have much time." As they entered the house, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Mrs. Abernathy led them to her cluttered living room, which had been transformed in their absence. Candles flickered on every surface, and strange symbols had been drawn on the floor in what looked unsettlingly like blood. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to 2 chairs placed within a circle of salt. "And whatever happens, do not break the circle." As they settled into the chairs, Mrs. Abernathy began to chant in a language neither of them recognized. The candles flared, their flames growing impossibly tall, and the room seemed to fade away around them. Mark felt a sudden, overwhelming sensation of falling. He tried to call out to Lucy, but no sound escaped his lips. Images flashed before his eyes, too fast to comprehend, until suddenly everything stopped. He found himself standing in a forest clearing, but it wasn't like any forest he had ever seen. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks twisting in unnatural shapes. The sky above was a swirling mass of colors that hurt to look at directly. "Where are we?" Lucy's voice came from beside him, and he turned to see her looking around in wonder and fear. "This is the in-between." Mrs. Abernathy's voice echoed around them, though she was nowhere to be seen. "A place that exists in the spaces between realities. Here I can show you what you need to know." The scene shifted, and suddenly they were watching events unfold like a movie playing all around them. They saw the first settlers arrive in the area that would become Whispering Pines, watched as they unknowingly built their homes on a nexus of cosmic energy. "The land was always special," Mrs. Abernathy narrated. "A thin spot in the fabric of reality, but it was the arrival of humans, with their hopes and fears and dreams, that truly awakened it." The images sped up, showing years passing in the blink of an eye. They saw strange occurrences throughout the town's history. Unexplained disappearances, ghostly sightings, moments when the veil between worlds seemed to lift. "For centuries the balance was maintained," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "The entities you encountered, the Watchers, could only peer through, never fully cross over. But something has changed." The scene shifted again, and Mark gasped as he recognized the clearing where they had camped. But it was different now, the trees carved with glowing symbols, the air shimmering with barely contained energy. "The symbols," Lucy whispered. "They're some kind of key?" "Yes," Mrs. Abernathy confirmed. "An ancient language forgotten by humans but remembered by the cosmos. With each symbol carved, the barrier weakens." They watched as shadowy figures began to seep through the shimmering air, becoming more solid with each passing moment. "But why now?" Mark asked, his voice echoing strangely in this otherworldly space. "Why is this happening after all this time?" The scene changed once more, and they found themselves watching a familiar figure, Tom, the ranger from the station. "Tom?" Lucy exclaimed. "What does he have to do with this?" They watched as Tom, looking much younger, stumbled upon an ancient book hidden in the depths of the forest. As he read from its pages, his eyes began to glow with an unnatural light. He didn't know what he was doing. Mrs. Abernathy's voice was heavy with sadness. He thought he was unlocking the secrets of the universe. Instead, he was opening a door that should have remained closed. The images faded, and they found themselves back in the strange forest of the in-between. "So it's Tom's fault?" Mark asked, trying to process everything they had seen. "He's the one who started all this?" "It's not that simple." Mrs. Abernathy appeared before them, her form shimmering and insubstantial. "Tom was a catalyst, yes, but the potential for this has always existed. The Watchers have been waiting for eons for such an opportunity." Lucy stepped forward, her face set with determination. "So how do we stop them? There has to be a way to close the door, right?" Mrs. Abernathy's expression turned grave. "There is a way, but it comes at a great cost. The doorway was opened with human will and human blood. To close it will require the same." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying someone has to die?" "Not die," Mrs. Abernathy shook her head, "but sacrifice themselves willingly. A soul freely given can seal the breach and banish the Watchers back to their realm." A heavy silence fell over them as the implications of her words sank in. Mark looked at Lucy, seeing the same mix of fear and resolve in her eyes that he felt in his heart. "I'll do it," Lucy said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." Mark grabbed her hand, pulling her close. "There has to be another way. We'll find it together." Mrs. Abernathy watched them with a sad smile. "Your love for each other is strong. It may be the key to all of this. But remember, the choice must be made freely, without coercion or regret." The world around them began to fade, the strange forest dissolving into mist. "Wait," Mark called out. "We still have so many questions." "Find Tom," Mrs. Abernathy's voice echoed as everything went dark. "He knows more than he's told you. And remember, time is running out. The Watchers grow stronger with each passing moment." With a jolt, Mark and Lucy found themselves back in Mrs. Abernathy's living room. The candles had burned down to stubs, and pale morning light was filtering through the windows. Mrs. Abernathy herself was slumped in her chair, looking exhausted. "You were under for hours," she said weakly. "I wasn't sure I'd be able to bring you back." Mark helped Lucy to her feet, both of them feeling disoriented from their otherworldly journey. "What do we do now?" he asked, looking to Mrs. Abernathy for guidance. The old woman struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her cane. "Now, you prepare for the fight of your lives. The Watchers know you're a threat. They'll stop at nothing to prevent you from closing the door." As if to emphasize her point, a loud crash came from outside. They rushed to the window to see a car had swerved off the road, narrowly missing Mrs. Abernathy's house. The driver stumbled out, his movements jerky and unnatural, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. "It's starting," Mrs. Abernathy said grimly. "The Watchers are possessing people, using them as vessels to enter our world fully." Mark and Lucy exchanged a determined look. Despite the terror of what they had learned, despite the seemingly impossible task before them, they knew they couldn't give up. "We need to find Tom," Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "And then we need to end this, once and for all." As they prepared to leave Mrs. Abernathy's house, stepping out into a world that had become a battleground between realities, both Mark and Lucy knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The fate of Whispering Pines, and perhaps the entire world, rested in their hands. And somewhere, in the spaces between worlds, the Watchers waited, their hunger growing with each passing second. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across Whispering Pines as Mark and Lucy made their way to the ranger station. The town seemed eerily quiet, with an occasional car passing by, its occupants looking dazed and confused. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from every darkened window and shadowy alley. "Do you think Tom will still be at the station?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "I don't know, but it's our best shot at finding him." As they approached the ranger station, they noticed the door was slightly ajar. Mark held out an arm, stopping Lucy. "Wait," he said, his voice tense. "Something's not right." They crept closer, and Mark cautiously pushed the door open. The interior of the station was a mess, papers strewn everywhere, chairs overturned. And there, in the center of the chaos, stood Tom. But it wasn't the Tom they remembered. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. When he spoke, his voice was a horrifying blend of his own and something other. "We've been expecting you," Tom, not Tom, said, a twisted smile stretching across his face. Mark instinctively pushed Lucy behind him. "Tom, if you're in there, we know what happened. We know about the book, about the Watchers. We want to help." Tom's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Help? You can't help. You can only submit. The door is open and we are coming through." Lucy stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "We know how to close the door, Tom. We can stop this. But we need your help." For a moment, something flickered in Tom's eyes, a glimpse of the man he used to be. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that eerie glow. "The human you knew as Tom is gone," the entity said. "We are many, and we will not be denied." With inhuman speed, Tom lunged at them. Mark reacted on instinct, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it with all his might. It connected with a sickening crack, and Tom went down. "Run!" Mark yelled, grabbing Lucy's hand. They sprinted out of the station, hearts pounding. Behind them, they could hear Tom getting to his feet, his inhuman shrieks echoing in the night. "Where do we go?" Lucy gasped as they ran. Mark's mind raced. "The campsite. That's where this all started. It's where it has to end." They made it to their car, fumbling with the keys as Tom's possessed form stumbled out of the station. As they peeled away, Mark could see more figures emerging from the shadows, all with that same eerie glow in their eyes. The drive to Whispering Pines campground was tense, the road twisting through dark forests that seemed alive with malevolent energy. More than once, Mark had to swerve to avoid figures that darted into the road, their forms flickering between human and something decidedly not. As they neared the campsite, an oppressive energy seemed to press down on them. The car's engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded at the edge of the woods. "We'll have to go on foot," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. They set off into the forest, the beam of the flashlight barely penetrating the unnatural darkness. The whispers they had heard before were back, louder now, almost forming words they could almost understand. Suddenly, Lucy stopped, her face pale in the dim light. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "I remember now. I know what we have to do." Mark turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" Lucy's eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "When I was connected with them before, I saw things. I understand now. The sacrifice, it has to be willing, but it doesn't have to be permanent." Mark shook his head, not comprehending. "Lucy, what are you saying?" "One of us has to offer ourselves to them," she explained. "Not to die, but to act as a bridge, to enter their world and close the door from the other side." The implications of what she was saying hit Mark like a physical blow. "No," he said firmly. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." Lucy took his hands in hers. "It's the only way, Mark. And it has to be me. I've already made a connection with them. I have the best chance of succeeding." Mark felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Lucy, no, I can't lose you." She smiled sadly, reaching up to touch his face. "You won't lose me. I'll find my way back. I promise." Before Mark could protest further, a chorus of unearthly shrieks filled the air. Possessed figures were emerging from the trees, surrounding them. "There's no time," Lucy said urgently. "We have to do this now." They ran towards the clearing where they had first camped, the horde of possessed townspeople hot on their heels. As they burst into the open space, Mark gasped. The air was shimmering, reality itself seeming to warp and twist. In the center of the clearing stood a figure that defied description, its form constantly shifting and changing. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The door is open," it intoned. "Our time has come." Lucy stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "I offer myself willingly. Take me, and leave this world in peace." The figure seemed to consider her for a moment. Then, with a gesture, a swirling vortex of energy appeared. "Lucy, please," Mark begged, grabbing her arm. "There has to be another way." She turned to him, her eyes filled with love and determination. "This is the way, Mark. Trust me." Before he could stop her, Lucy stepped towards the vortex. The possessed figures that had been pursuing them fell back, watching in what seemed like awe. As Lucy reached the edge of the swirling energy, she turned back one last time. "I love you, Mark. I'll come back to you. I promise." And with that, she stepped into the vortex and vanished. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The air seemed to explode with light and sound. Mark was thrown backward, landing hard on the forest floor. Around him, he could hear the possessed townspeople screaming, but these were human screams now, filled with confusion and fear. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The unnatural darkness lifted and the first rays of dawn began to peek through the trees. Mark struggled to his feet, looking around in disbelief. The townspeople were picking themselves up, looking dazed and confused. Tom stumbled over to Mark, his eyes clear and human once more. What happened?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse. "The last thing I remember is finding that book and then... nothing." Mark couldn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the spot where Lucy had vanished. There was no sign of the vortex, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened there. As the sun rose over Whispering Pines, Mark fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Lucy was gone, having sacrificed herself to save them all. But she had made a promise, and Mark clung to it like a lifeline. She would find her way back. She had to. In the days that followed, Whispering Pines slowly returned to normal. The townspeople had no memory of their possession, and the strange events were quickly rationalized away. But Mark knew the truth, and he vowed to wait for Lucy, no matter how long it took. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he could swear he heard her voice on the wind, calling to him from across the veil between worlds, promising that one day somehow she would keep her promise and return to him. The door was closed, the watchers banished. But at what cost? And was it truly over, or merely the end of the beginning? Only time would tell. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Mark remained in Whispering Pines, unable to leave the place where he had last seen Lucy. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, spending his days researching everything he could about interdimensional travel, and his nights walking the forests, hoping for any sign of Lucy's return. The town had largely returned to normal, the strange events of that fateful night fading into local legend. But for Mark, every moment was a reminder of what he had lost, and what he hoped to regain. It was on a crisp autumn evening, exactly 6 months after Lucy's disappearance, that everything changed again. Mark was sitting on the porch of his cabin, a book on quantum physics open on his lap, when he felt it, a shift in the air, a feeling of electricity that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He looked up, his heart racing to see the air in front of him shimmering and distorting. "Lucy," he whispered, hardly daring to hope. The distortion grew, stretching and twisting until it formed a shape that was almost, but not quite human. When it spoke, the voice was a cacophony of sounds, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once. "The one you seek is not here," the entity said, "but she sends a message." Mark stood, his legs shaking. "What message? Is she okay? How can I get her back?" The entity's form rippled, and for a moment Mark thought he saw Lucy's face within its swirling mass. "The door is weakening," it said. "The sacrifice was not enough. We come again." Before Mark could ask anything more, the entity vanished, leaving him alone on the porch, his mind reeling. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he was in his car, speeding towards Mrs. Abernathy's house. The old woman opened the door before he could even knock, her face grave. "You felt it too," she said. It wasn't a question. Mark nodded, following her inside. "They're coming back. Lucy's sacrifice. It wasn't enough." Mrs. Abernathy sighed heavily, lowering herself into a chair. "I feared this might happen. The balance is delicate and the watchers are persistent." "So what do we do?" Mark asked, pacing the room. "How do we stop them this time?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes gleamed with a fierce determination. "We fight. We gather every resource, every bit of knowledge we have, and we face them head on." And so began a frantic period of preparation. Mark and Mrs. Abernathy reached out to everyone they could think of who might be able to help. Occultists, physicists, even a few government contacts Mrs. Abernathy had from her mysterious past. Tom, still racked with guilt over his unwitting role in starting all of this, threw himself into the preparations. He used his position as park ranger to close off the areas of the forest where the veil between worlds was thinnest, citing environmental concerns. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the signs of the Watcher's return became more apparent. Strange lights were seen in the sky, electronics malfunctioned across town, and more people reported hearing whispers in the dark. Finally, on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, it began. Mark stood in the clearing where Lucy had disappeared, surrounded by a motley crew of allies. Mrs. Abernathy was there, of course, along with Tom and a handful of townspeople who had been convinced of the danger. They had formed a circle, each holding a variety of objects, ancient talismans, high-tech devices, and everything in between. As the clock struck midnight, the air began to shimmer and twist. The whispers that had been plaguing the town rose to a deafening roar, and the very fabric of reality seemed to stretch and tear. "Hold the line," Mrs. Abernathy shouted over the noise. "Focus your will, your belief. We are the barrier between worlds." Mark gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of his being into the effort. He thought of Lucy, of her sacrifice, of her promise to return. He would not let her efforts be in vain. The first of the Watchers began to push through the weakening veil. They were even more terrifying than Mark remembered, shifting, otherworldly forms that hurt the eyes to look at directly. "Now!" Mrs. Abernathy cried. As one, the group began to chant, a mix of ancient incantations and scientific formulae that Mrs. Abernathy had woven together into a defense against the interdimensional invasion. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The Watchers recoiled, their forms wavering as they struggled against the barrier of human will and belief. But then something changed. A new entity emerged from the rift, larger, more powerful, and horrifyingly familiar. "Lucy?" Mark gasped, his concentration faltering. The being that had once been Lucy turned its gaze on him, and Mark felt his heart break all over again. There was nothing of the woman he loved in those alien eyes. "Your efforts are futile," the Lucy thing said, its voice a twisted parody of her once warm tones. "We have consumed your mate, as we will consume your world." "No!" Mark shouted, anger and grief giving him new strength. "Lucy, I know you're in there. Fight them!" For a split second, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the entity's eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by cold, alien hunger. The entity that had been Lucy raised its arms, and the rift began to widen. More Watchers poured through, overwhelming the group's defenses. "We're losing ground," Tom yelled, his voice strained. "We can't hold them back." Mrs. Abernathy turned to Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "There's only one way to end this," she said. "We have to close the rift from both sides." Mark understood immediately. "You mean—" She nodded. "One of us has to go through like Lucy did, but this time we'll be ready. We'll close it properly once and for all." "I'll go," Mark said without hesitation. "I have to try to save her." Mrs. Abernathy gripped his arm. "Are you sure? There's no guarantee you'll be able to return." Mark looked at the being that had once been Lucy, his heart aching. "I'm sure. I promised I'd never leave her. I intend to keep that promise." With a nod, Mrs. Abernathy began a new chant. The others joined in, their voices rising above the chaos of the battle. Mark felt a surge of energy flow through him, preparing him for what was to come. "Remember," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice strained with effort, "find Lucy's essence. It's the key to closing the rift permanently." Mark nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped towards the rift. The Lucy thing watched him approach, its alien features twisting into something that might have been curiosity. "Lucy," Mark said, staring into its eyes, "if you're in there, I'm coming for you. I love you." And with that, he plunged into the rift. The sensation was indescribable, like being torn apart and put back together 1,000 times a second. Mark felt his consciousness expand, touching the minds of countless beings across countless realities. And there, in the chaos of interdimensional space, he felt her, a flicker of the woman he loved. "Lucy," he called out with his mind, pushing through the maelstrom of competing realities. He felt her respond, weak, but undeniably there. With all his will, all his love, he reached for her. In that moment, as their essences touched across the vastness of the multiverse, Mark understood. He saw the nature of reality, the delicate balance between worlds, and knew what had to be done. With Lucy's consciousness joined with his, they turned their combined will against the rift. Reality buckled and warped around them, the very fabric of existence straining under the pressure. Back in the clearing, Mrs. Abernathy and the others watched in awe as the rift began to close. The watchers shrieked in fury and fear, their forms dissolving as they were forced back into their own dimension. With a final, reality-shaking burst of energy, the rift slammed shut. The clearing was plunged into silence, the air still and calm for the first time in months. Where the rift had been, two figures lay on the ground, Mark and Lucy, unconscious but undeniably human and alive. As the group rushed to help them, Mrs. Abernathy smiled, tears in her eyes. "They did it," she whispered. "They actually did it." The battle was over. The watchers were gone. The rift was closed, and the world was safe. At least for now. But as Mark and Lucy were tended to, no one noticed the small, swirling distortion that remained in the air, barely visible in the moonlight. A reminder, perhaps, that some doors can never be fully closed and that the battle between realities is never truly over. The first rays of dawn were breaking over Whispering Pines as Mark slowly regained consciousness. His head throbbed, and every muscle in his body ached, as if he'd run a marathon. As his eyes fluttered open, he found himself lying on a soft bed, the familiar scent of antiseptic telling him he was in a hospital. "Lucy," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Easy there, son," came a gentle voice. Mark turned his head to see Tom sitting beside his bed, looking tired but relieved. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Mark tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "Where's Lucy? Is she okay?" Tom placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder. "She's fine. She's in the next room, still unconscious but stable. The doctors say you both should make a full recovery." Relief washed over Mark, followed quickly by a flood of memories. The battle, the rift, the journey through realities, it all came rushing back. "The Watchers," he said urgently. "Are they gone? Did we stop them?" Tom nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You did it, Mark. You and Lucy. The rift is closed, and there's been no sign of the Watchers since that night. Mrs. Abernathy says the veil between worlds is stronger than ever." Mark sank back into his pillows, overwhelmed by the knowledge that it was truly over. They had won. Over the next few days, Mark's strength gradually returned. Lucy woke up the day after him, and as soon as they were both able, the hospital staff moved them into the same room. "I thought I'd lost you," Mark said softly, holding Lucy's hand as they lay in their adjacent beds. "When I saw you, or what they'd turned you into." Lucy squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I was lost, Mark. For so long I was drifting in that other place, feeling myself slip away bit by bit. But I always held on to the memory of you, of us. It was the only thing that kept me. Mark brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I would have searched every reality to find you." "I know," Lucy smiled. "That's exactly what you did." As they recovered, visitors came and went. Mrs. Abernathy was a frequent presence, bringing books on meditation and energy work to help them process their interdimensional experiences. Tom stopped by daily, still wrestling with guilt over his role in the initial opening of the rift. "I don't know how I can ever make up for what I did," Tom said one afternoon, his eyes downcast. Lucy reached out, patting his arm. "Tom, you were as much a victim as anyone. What matters is how you helped in the end. We couldn't have done it without you." Tom looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. You really mean that? Mark nodded. Absolutely. You're part of this now, Tom. Part of our, well, I guess you could call it our interdimensional defense squad. They all chuckled at that, the laughter helping to ease the tension that had built up over months of fear and uncertainty. As Mark and Lucy's discharge date approached, they began to discuss what would come next. We can't just go back to our old lives, Lucy said, absently tracing patterns on Mark's arm as they sat together on her bed. Not after everything we've seen, everything we know. Mark nodded, understanding completely. I've been thinking about that. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned that there are other thin spots in the world, other places where the veil between realities is weak. Lucy's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. You want to find them? To protect them? I think we have to, Mark said softly. We have a responsibility now. We understand these forces in a way few others do. We can't just ignore that knowledge. Lucy was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she smiled, that adventurous spark that Mark had fallen in love with shining in her eyes. Well, I did always want to travel the world. I just never imagined it would be to defend it from interdimensional invaders. They both laughed, the sound filled with equal parts excitement and trepidation for the journey ahead. The day of their discharge arrived, and as they packed up their few belongings, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Abernathy entered, followed by Tom, and, to their surprise, a man in a crisp suit they didn't recognize. Mark, Lucy, Mrs. Abernathy said, her tone serious. There's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Agent Blackwood. He's with a specialized branch of the government. Agent Blackwood stepped forward, his piercing blue eyes assessing them carefully. Mr. Holloway, Ms. Chen, it's an honor to meet you both. I've been briefed on your extraordinary experiences and abilities. Mark and Lucy exchanged a wary glance. And what exactly does that mean for us? Mark asked cautiously. Agent Blackwood's expression softened slightly. It means, Mr. Holloway, that we'd like to offer you both a job. Your unique insights into interdimensional phenomena could be invaluable in protecting not just this country, but the entire world. Lucy raised an eyebrow. You mean there are others out there? Other rifts? Other incursions? More than you can imagine. Agent Blackwood nodded. We've been monitoring and containing these events for decades, but we've never had anyone with your level of direct experience. Your help could save countless lives. Mark and Lucy looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. After everything they'd been through, the idea of a normal life seemed impossible. But this was a chance to make a difference, to use their harrowing experiences for good. We're in, Mark said finally, Lucy nodding in agreement. On one condition. Agent Blackwood raised an eyebrow. And that is? We work as a team, Lucy said firmly. All of us. She gestured to Mrs. Abernathy and Tom. We've been through this together. We understand each other. We're stronger together. Agent Blackwood considered for a moment, then smiled. I think that can be arranged. Welcome to the Interdimensional Defense Initiative. As they left the hospital together, stepping out into a world that looked the same but felt profoundly different, Mark felt a mix of emotions. Excitement, fear, determination. He looked at Lucy, seeing the same cocktail of feelings reflected in her eyes. Ready for our next adventure? He asked, taking her hand. Lucy grinned, squeezing his hand. Always. As long as we're together. They walked towards the waiting government car, ready to embark on a new chapter in their lives. The battle for Whispering Pines was over, but they all knew that the war to protect the barriers between worlds was just beginning. As they drove away, none of them noticed the slight shimmer in the air near the hospital entrance, or the whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. We will return. The story of Whispering Pines was over, but for Mark, Lucy, and their unlikely team of interdimensional defenders, a new story, filled with danger, discovery, and the eternal balance between realities, was just beginning.